The shot echoed through the hill country like thunder, sending birds scattering into the pale spring sky. Naomi Wallace ran barefoot through the underbrush, her tattered dress catching on thorns and branches that tore at her skin like desperate hands. She didn't feel the pain. Not anymore. The searing agony in her thigh had become a dull throb that matched the pounding of her heart. Behind her, voices carried on the night air. Men's voices, angry voices. Find her, the union nurse knows too much. Caleb Thorne's command cut through the darkness, as sharp and deadly as the knife he'd used to brand her just days before. Naomi could still smell her own burning flesh, could still hear his whispered words as he pressed the hot iron against her skin. You belong to me now, all of you do. Naomi stumbled, her feet bloody and raw as she half slid down a rocky embankment. The wound on her thigh split open again, warm blood coursing down her leg. She bit back a cry, knowing any sound would bring them to her. The wound was infected, she could tell by the heat radiating from it, by the red streaks beginning to climb up her leg. Without treatment, she'd be dead in days. Perhaps that would be a mercy. The moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the forest into darkness. Naomi heard the rushing of water ahead, a stream or creek cutting through the limestone hills. She pushed forward, brambles slashing at her arms and face. She needed to cross it, to wash away her scent, to put something between herself and the hunting party. Naomi reached the creek's edge, the water black and mysterious in the darkness. Behind her, lantern light bounced between the trees. They were getting closer. She slid down the muddy bank and into the frigid water, gasping as it reached her waist. The current was stronger than she expected, tugging at her weakened body. She took one step, then another, the rocky creek bed slippery beneath her feet. Halfway across, her strength finally failed her. Her legs buckled, and the current caught her, pulling her downstream. Water filled her mouth, her nose. She couldn't fight anymore. As consciousness began to slip away, Naomi Wallace did something she hadn't done since the war began. She prayed, "Please, if there's any mercy left in this world." The prayer died unfinished as darkness claimed her. Jackson Emerson stood motionless on the creek bank, his weathered face impassive in the moonlight. He'd heard the gunshot nearly a mile back, followed by the distant shouts of men on a hunt. Not deer, not coyote. Men hunting a person. It wasn't his concern. After 2 years of hiding in these hills, Jackson had learned that other people's troubles belonged to them alone. The war had taken his hearing in one ear, his voice by choice, and his faith in humanity entirely. All he wanted was to be left alone with his maps, his journals, and his memories. And yet here he was, staring down at the half-drowned woman who had washed up on the creek bank like debris after a storm. She was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair plastered to a face pale as milk in the moonlight. Her dress, once fine but now in tatters, clung to her thin frame. Blood seeped from a wound on her thigh, mixing with the creek water to form pale red swirls on the limestone rocks. Jackson heard voices upriver and instinctively crouched lower. Lantern light bobbed between trees on the far bank. 5 men, maybe 6. Armed, dangerous, determined. The woman's eyes fluttered open, revealing irises as blue as summer cornflowers. Fear flooded them as she registered his presence, his size, his beard, his rifle. She tried to scramble away, but her body betrayed her. A whimper escaped her lips, so soft only someone attuned to the forest's silence would have heard it. "Just kill me fast," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "Please." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. Not a plea for help, not a cry for mercy, just a request for a quick end, as if kindness in this world had been reduced to the speed of one's execution. For 2 years, he kept his promise to speak to no one, to remain apart from a world gone mad. Now he broke it with 4 simple words. "I'm not here to show." He extended his hand toward her, calloused palm open in the moonlight. The woman stared at it as if it were a snake poised to strike. The voices grew closer. "They'll kill us both," she whispered. Jackson simply kept his hand extended, steady as stone. After what seemed like eternity, she reached up and placed her trembling fingers in his palm. Her skin was ice cold, slick with creek water and blood. In one fluid motion, Jackson lifted her from the creek bed. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, like a half-drowned sparrow. He carried her up the bank and into the shadows of the forest, moving with the silent confidence of a man who knew every root and stone by heart. Behind them, lanterns illuminated the spot where she had washed ashore. Men's voices rose in anger at finding nothing but blood-stained rocks. "Spread out! She can't have gone far!" Jackson moved deeper into the forest, the woman shivering violently against his chest. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that spoke of fever and impending shock. The infection in her leg wound was advancing rapidly. Without treatment, she wouldn't survive the night. "Why?" she whispered against his shoulder. "Why help me?" Jackson didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know himself. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like a ghost-weathered cedar planks, silver in the moonlight. It wasn't much a single room with a stone fireplace nestled beneath ancient oak trees that concealed it from casual observation. Jackson had built it himself after the war. Far from roads or settlements, a place where the screams in his head wouldn't disturb anyone but himself. He kicked the door open with one foot and carried the woman inside, laying her gently on the bearskin rug near the cold hearth. She was barely conscious now, her skin burning with fever despite her shivering. Working quickly, Jackson lit the kindling he'd prepared earlier, bringing flames to life with practiced motions. The firelight revealed a sparse but orderly interior. Dried herbs hung from ceiling beams. Bookshelves lined one wall crammed with leather-bound volumes. Maps covered another wall marked with notations in a precise hand. A narrow cot occupied one corner, a writing desk another. The woman's eyes fluttered open, taking in her surroundings with a desperate awareness of prey. She tried to sit up but fell back with a gasp of pain. "Where?" she began. Jackson placed a finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, then pointed toward the window. They weren't safe yet. The hunting party could still be nearby. He moved to a cupboard and withdrew clean cloths, a ceramic bowl, and a wooden box filled with small glass bottles. Setting these beside her, he pointed to the wound on her thigh visible through the torn dress, then raised his eyebrows in question. The woman's face hardened with understanding. She gave a single tight nod. Jackson gestured toward the tattered dress, then mimed cutting it away. Another nod, this one accompanied by closed eyes and a face turned away in resignation. Using a hunting knife, Jackson carefully cut away the fabric around the wound. What he saw made his jaw tighten. The gash was deep edges, angry and inflamed. But it was what surrounded it that caused his breath to catch. Branded into her flesh was a symbol, a circle with a stylized T at its center, the skin puckered and red against her pale thigh. The woman's eyes opened, catching his expression. Shame flooded her face and she tried to cover the brand with her hand. "Now you know what I am," she whispered. Jackson shook his head firmly. He pointed to the brand, then made a dismissive gesture before pointing to her face, her eyes. His meaning was clear. That mark doesn't define you. Reaching for one of the glass bottles, Jackson uncorked it and poured a pungent liquid onto a clean cloth. He hesitated, then pointed to the wound and grimaced, warning her of the pain to come. "Do what you must," she said, bracing herself. When the herb-infused alcohol touched the infected wound, she arched off the floor, a scream building in her throat. Jackson quickly covered her mouth with his free hand, muffling the sound. Tears streamed down her face as he cleaned the wound thoroughly, removing dirt and debris with methodical care. Outside, a twig snapped. Jackson froze his hand, still covering the woman's mouth. She went rigid beneath him, eyes wide with terror. Slowly, he reached for his rifle propped against the wall. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, accompanied by the jingle of spurs. A man's voice called out, deep and confident. Come out, little nurse. We know you're here somewhere." The woman trembled violently, recognition flooding her eyes. Jackson motioned for her to stay still, then moved silently to the window, keeping to the shadows. Through a gap in the shutters, he saw a tall figure standing in the clearing, lantern held high. Even in profile, there was something commanding about the man, broad-shouldered, straight-backed, with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Caleb Thorne. Jackson had never met the man, but he'd heard the stories. Former Union Army captain turned regional power broker. Respected by some, feared by many. What the stories didn't mention was his side business in human trafficking, apparently. "The longer you hide, the worse it'll be," Thorne called into the darkness. "You took something that belongs to me, Naomi. I want it back." Naomi, so that was her name. Another voice called from the forest's edge. "Nothing here, sir. Just an old trapper's cabin. Looks abandoned." Thorne's shoulders stiffened with frustration. "Keep searching. She couldn't have gotten far, not with that leg. And remember, I want her alive." He turned, giving Jackson a clearer view of his face for the first time. Handsome in a severe way, with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes cold as river stones. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, puckering the skin into a permanent sneer. "I know you can hear me, Naomi," Thorne called into the night. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you'll tell, no one will believe you. You're just another broken thing now branded and used. Come back and I'll be merciful." Inside the cabin, Naomi's breathing had quickened to the point of hyperventilation. Jackson moved back to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Her skin burned beneath his touch. Thorne stood in the clearing for another long moment, then extinguished his lantern. "Burn it," he said to someone unseen. "Burn it all. If she's hiding in these woods, smoke her out." Jackson's blood ran cold. Forest fire. In spring, with everything tinder dry after a mild winter, it would spread for miles. Hundreds of acres would burn. Wildlife would perish. And his cabin, his sanctuary, would be reduced to ash. He had seconds to decide. Stay hidden and hope the fire missed them, or reveal himself and face whatever came. As the first torch arced through the darkness toward a stand of dry brush, Jackson made his choice. The cabin door burst open and Jackson Emerson stepped into the moonlight rifle held loosely at his side but clearly visible. Thorne's men reacted immediately, weapons swinging toward the unexpected appearance. "Hold," Thorne commanded, raising a hand. His cold eyes narrowed, assessing the bearded stranger before him. Well, well, the hills do have eyes, it seems." Jackson stood motionless, his face impassive. 1 against 6 were not odds he favored, but he'd survived worse. "You're either very brave or very foolish, friend," Thorne said, stepping forward. "We're looking for a woman, dark hair, blue eyes, wounded, a runaway from my establishment. Seen anyone like that?" Jackson shook his head slowly. "A man of few words," Thorne observed. "Or perhaps no words at all, no matter. I'll ask once more, and I expect an honest answer." His hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "Have you seen this woman?" Again, Jackson shook his head. Thorne studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "Search the cabin," he ordered, without taking his eyes off Jackson. 2 men moved forward, but Jackson shifted, blocking the doorway. His message was clear. "No one enters." "Interesting," Thorne said softly. "Now why would a lone trapper risk his life to protect his privacy, unless of course he's hiding something, or someone?" In the tense silence that followed, a night owl called from the forest, its cry mournful in the darkness. Thorne cocked his head as if listening to something only he could hear. "It's late, we're all tired. Perhaps a night in the forest has made me suspicious of simple mountain hospitality." He gestured and his men lowered their weapons slightly. "What's your name, friend?" Jackson said nothing, his expression unchanged. "Not much for conversation, I respect that." Thorne reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, which he tossed at Jackson's feet. It landed with a metallic clink. "Consider that payment for any inconvenience we've caused. A man who lives alone in these hills must value information as much as gold. If you see our runaway, there's more where that came from." Jackson made no move to retrieve the pouch. Pride. Another admirable quality. Thorne nodded to his men. "Mount up. We'll continue at first light." As they turned to leave, Thorne paused. "One last thing, friend. If you are harboring her, remember this: that woman is my property. She bears my mark, and I always recover what's mine." Jackson stood in the doorway until the last sounds of horses faded into the night. Only then did he retrieve the pouch, weighing it in his palm before pocketing it. Payment or blood money, it made little difference now. He'd made his choice. Inside, Naomi lay where he'd left her, her face a mask of terror and fever. "They'll come back," she whispered. "They always come back." Jackson knelt beside her, resuming his treatment of her wound. He mixed herbs from several bottles into a paste which he applied to the infection with gentle fingers. The cabin smelled of juniper, yarrow, and fear. "Why didn't you give me to them?" Naomi asked, watching his movements through half-lidded eyes. "They would have paid you more than what's in that pouch." Jackson paused in his work, considering her question. Finally, he reached for a slate and chalk that hung by the fireplace, his means of communication when gestures wouldn't suffice. In careful script, he wrote a single sentence: "Not everyone is for sale." Naomi read the words, surprise flickering across her fever-flushed face. "You truly believe that, after all that's happened, after the war—" Jackson erased the slate with his palm and wrote again. "Especially after the war." He set the slate aside and continued treating her wound, wrapping it in clean bandages torn from one of his own shirts. The brand remained visible, an angry reminder of what she'd endured. "My name is Naomi," she said softly. "Naomi Wallace." Jackson nodded once, acknowledging the introduction. He pointed to himself, then to a carving on the mantelpiece, J. Emerson. "Jackson," she guessed. Another nod. "Well, Jackson Emerson," she whispered, as exhaustion finally claimed her. "I hope saving me doesn't get you killed." As she drifted into fevered sleep, Jackson returned to the window, watching the forest for any sign of Thorne's return. The man's words echoed in his mind. "She bears my mark, and I always recover what's mine." Jackson's hand drifted to his chest, where beneath his shirt lay scars of his own, not from a brand, but from the war that had taken so much from so many. Scars were just history written on skin. They didn't define the future. At least that's what he told himself in the long, dark hours before dawn. Naomi's fever broke on the third day. She woke to find sunlight streaming through the cabin's open door, illuminating dust motes that danced like golden spirits in the morning air. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was the stench of unwashed bodies? The sounds of women weeping? The ever-present fear? Memory returned in a rush, bringing with it the phantom pain of the brand on her thigh. She sat up quickly, then groaned as her body protested the sudden movement. "Hello?" She called, her voice raspy from disuse. No answer came. The cabin stood empty, though signs of habitation surrounded her. A kettle steamed gently on the small iron stove. Fresh bandages lay folded on a nearby stool. Her dress cleaned and mended with neat, if somewhat clumsy stitches hung from a peg on the wall. Naomi examined her wound, surprised to find the angry redness receding. The infection was responding to treatment. Whatever concoction Jackson had used, it was working. She glanced around the cabin, seeing it properly for the first time. What had seemed sparse in the darkness revealed itself as austere, but thoughtfully arranged in daylight. Bookshelves held volumes on medicine, botany, and military history. The maps on the wall detailed not only the surrounding territory, but also troop movements from the recent war. A Union Army uniform jacket hung in one corner, its sleeve bearing the insignia of the 23rd Infantry. He was a soldier, Naomi realized. Like so many broken men I've treated. A journal lay open on the writing desk, filled with the same precise handwriting she'd seen on the slate. Page after page of observations about local plants, weather patterns, animal migrations. The writings of a man who watched the world carefully, but participated in it rarely. Moving carefully to avoid reopening her wound, Naomi made her way to the open door. The cabin perched on a small rise, providing a view of the surrounding forest and the creek below. Wildflowers dotted the clearing in splashes of yellow and blue. In the distance, limestone cliffs caught the morning sun, glowing like pale gold against the green canopy. It was beautiful, peaceful. The kind of place that made you forget just for a moment what people were capable of doing to each other. Movement at the creek's edge caught her attention. Jackson knelt by the water, his back to the cabin, as he checked what appeared to be fishing lines. His shirt hung from a nearby branch, revealing a torso mapped with scars, some old and white, others newer and still pink. The war wrote its story on him too, she thought. As if sensing her gaze, Jackson turned. Seeing her standing in the doorway, he rose and gathered his shirt, pulling it on as he approached. There was no embarrassment in his movements, just the efficiency of a man used to living alone. "The fever broke," Naomi said as he reached the cabin. "Thanks to you." Jackson nodded, his expression unchanging, save for a slight softening around the eyes. He gestured toward her leg with a questioning tilt of his head. "Better. Still painful, but the infection is retreating." She hesitated, then added, "You know about medicine." He shrugged modestly, then pointed to a row of books visible through the doorway, followed by a gesture toward the forest. "Books and practical experience," Naomi translated. "The best teachers." A ghost of a smile touched Jackson's lips before vanishing again. He moved past her into the cabin, returning moments later with the slate. In careful script, he wrote, "You should eat. Regain strength." Naomi nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow emptiness in her stomach. How long had it been since she'd eaten properly? Days, weeks at Thorne's establishment, food had been yet another means of control, doled out as reward or withheld as punishment. Jackson led her to a crude table beneath an oak tree, motioning for her to sit on one of two hand-hewn stools. He disappeared into the cabin and returned with 2 bowls of simple stew, fragrant with wild onions and rabbit meat. Naomi ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger as her body demanded nourishment. Jackson watched her, his own food barely touched. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked between mouthfuls. He shook his head, then wrote on the slate, "You need it more." Naomi paused, struck by the simple kindness. How long had it been since someone had put her needs first? She couldn't remember. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for not turning me over to them, for treating my wound, for feeding me." Jackson looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. He wrote quickly, "Anyone would have done the same." A bitter laugh escaped Naomi before she could stop it. "No, Jackson, they wouldn't. Believe me, I've learned that lesson well." His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw understanding born of similar experience. He knew as she did how rare true kindness had become. They finished the meal in silence, a spring breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant song of a mockingbird. For the first time in months, Naomi felt something close to peace. It wouldn't last, of course. It couldn't. But for now, in this hidden clearing, with this silent man, she allowed herself to remember what safety felt like. As twilight painted the limestone cliffs in shades of amber, and Rose Jackson built a small fire in the clearing. The nights were still cool in the Texas hill country spring, not yet fully committed to its warming course. Naomi sat wrapped in a faded quilt, watching as he methodically added sticks to the growing flames. 3 days had passed since her fever broke. 3 days of quiet recovery, of regaining strength, of watching Jackson move through his solitary routines. He hunted in the mornings, fished in the afternoons, and read by candlelight in the evenings. Sometimes he wrote in his journal pages of neat script that Naomi couldn't read from her distance, but sensed were important to him. They had developed a rhythm of sorts. He would write short questions or comments on the slate. She would respond verbally. He never pressed for details about her past or how she'd come to be running through the forest that night. And she never asked why he chose silence, why he lived alone in the wilderness, or how he'd acquired the knowledge to save her life. Some questions felt too dangerous, the answers too raw. But as the fire crackled between them and the first stars appeared overhead, Naomi found herself wanting to bridge the careful distance they'd maintained. "I was a nurse," she said abruptly, "during the war." Jackson looked up from the fire sirens flickering across his normally impassive features. "Union Army Medical Corps. I treated wounded from both sides, Confederate Union. It didn't matter once they were on my table." She stared into the flames, seeing not the fire before her, but the blood-soaked tents of field hospitals. "I thought I'd seen the worst of humanity during those years. I was wrong." Jackson remained silent, his eyes reflecting the firelight as he watched her face. "After the war, I stayed in Texas to help establish proper medical care. There was such need, especially in the rural areas." Her fingers twisted in the quilt. "That's when I met Caleb Thorne. He was recruiting medical personnel for what he called reconstruction efforts. Said he needed experienced nurses to help with a typhoid outbreak near the border." Jackson's expression darkened at Thorne's name. "There was no typhoid outbreak." Naomi continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "What he had was a compound, half prison, half brothel, where he kept women captive. Some were war widows with nowhere to go. Some were former slaves who thought they were heading north to freedom. Some were just girls who trusted the wrong person." She touched her thigh where the brand lay hidden beneath her dress. "When I realized what was happening and tried to help them escape, Thorne decided I needed to be taught my place. That's when he—" Her voice faltered. Jackson reached for the slate, his movements deliberate. He wrote a single word: survived. Naomi looked up, meeting his steady gaze across the fire. "Yes," she said softly, "I survived, but so many didn't." Jackson added to his message, "Not your fault." Tears blurred Naomi's vision. How had he known exactly what she needed to hear? The guilt that gnawed at her, that kept her awake in the dark hours, the knowledge that she had escaped while others remained captive. "I should have done more," she whispered. "I should have found a way to save them all." Jackson shook his head firmly, then wrote, "One person cannot save everyone, but everyone can save someone." The simple wisdom of his words struck Naomi like a physical force. She had been carrying the weight of all those women, all their suffering, as if it were hers alone to bear, as if her escape somehow betrayed them. "Is that why you saved me?" she asked. "To save someone?" Jackson stared into the fire for a long moment before writing, "I saved you because you needed saving. No other reason necessary." The straightforward honesty of his answer brought fresh tears to Naomi's eyes. In a world of ulterior motives and hidden agendas, Jackson's simple declaration felt revolutionary. "I wish there were more like you," she said quietly. He gave her a sad half-smile and wrote, "There are, just hard to find sometimes." They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower and night fully claimed the sky. Stars emerged in their thousands, so bright and numerous, they seemed close enough to touch. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. "What will happen now?" Naomi finally asked, voicing the question that had haunted her since awakening. "Thorne won't stop looking for me." Jackson considered her words, then wrote carefully, "You could go north, start over. With what I have, nothing. No money, no possessions, no identification." She laughed bitterly. "And even if I did, how far would I get with this?" She gestured toward her thigh. Jackson frowned, then wrote, "The brand doesn't define you." "Doesn't it?" Naomi challenged. "In every town, every settlement, people will see it and know exactly what I am, what I was." Jackson shook his head vigorously and underlined his previous words with 3 firm strokes. "The brand doesn't define you." The force of his insistence startled Naomi. She looked at him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. His face was weathered by sun and hardship, his beard shot through with premature gray. But his eyes held a clarity and certainty that brooked no argument. "You truly believe that, don't you?" she asked softly. Jackson nodded once definitive. Then he added to his message, "Scars tell where we've been, not where we're going." Something shifted in Naomi's chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and despair she'd carried since Thorne had pressed that iron to her flesh. Maybe Jackson was right. Maybe the brand was just another scar, a mark of survival rather than ownership. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure if she was thanking him for the words for saving her life, or for the first fragile tendril of hope she'd felt in months. Jackson simply nodded, his eyes reflecting starlight as the fire burned down to embers between them. Dawn arrived with a ghostly mist that clung to the creek and wound between the trees like spectral fingers. Jackson stood at the cabin door watching the forest awaken around him. Birds called tentatively, at first, then with increasing confidence as daylight strengthened. A deer and her fawn stepped delicately through the clearing, pausing to graze on tender spring growth before disappearing into the underbrush. Behind him, Naomi still slept on his cot, her face peaceful for once, unmarred by the fear that had shadowed it since her arrival. She was recovering quickly, too quickly, perhaps. Soon she would be strong enough to leave, and then decisions would need to be made. Jackson turned back to the forest, scanning the tree line out of habit. He'd seen no sign of Thorne or his men since that first night, but instinct told him they hadn't given up. Men like Thorne didn't surrender what they considered theirs, especially when pride was involved. Movement at the forest's edge caught his attention, a flash of blue among the green that didn't belong. Jackson reached for his rifle, leveling it at the spot where he'd seen the anomaly. A moment later, a figure emerged from the trees, hands raised in the universal gesture of peace. A woman older than Naomi with gray-streaked hair and the careworn face of someone who had seen too much hardship. She wore a faded blue dress that had caught his eye among the foliage. "Don't shoot, please," she called softly. "I'm looking for the nurse, for Naomi." Jackson kept the rifle aimed at her, suspicion evident in his stance. The woman took a careful step forward. "My name is Eleanor Martin. I'm from the settlement at Bandera." She lowered her hands slowly. "I help people like her, people who escape from Thorne's place." Still, Jackson didn't lower his weapon. Too convenient, this woman appearing now, knowing Naomi's name and location. "I understand your caution," Eleanor said, "but time is short. Thorne's men are combing the hills. They've already searched my house twice." From inside the cabin came Naomi's voice, tense with recognition. "Jackson, who's there?" Eleanor's face brightened. "Naomi, it's Eleanor. Thank God you're alive." Naomi appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. Her eyes widened at the sight of the older woman. "Eleanor, how did you find me?" "Luther Reeves told me where to look," Eleanor replied. "He said a mountain man had taken you in." Jackson glanced between the women, confusion evident in his expression. Naomi caught his look and explained. "Eleanor runs the church in Bandera. She's been helping women escape from Thorne for years." She turned back to Eleanor. "But Luther Reeves works for Thorne. Why would he help you find me?" "Not everything is as it seems, Naomi." Eleanor's gaze darted nervously toward the forest. "May I come inside? It's not safe to talk in the open." Jackson finally lowered his rifle, stepping aside to allow Eleanor to enter the cabin. As she passed, she studied his face with curious intensity. "You're Jackson Emerson," she said, not as a question but as recognition. "Isaiah's brother." Jackson froze, shock evident in his suddenly pale face. No one in these parts should know that name, his brother's name. No one. Eleanor reached out, touching his arm gently. "He spoke of you at the end, said you'd come for him, but it was too late." The slate clattered to the floor as Jackson's hands began to tremble. He made a single urgent gesture, pointing to Eleanor, then to his own chest, his expression desperate with question. "How do I know Isaiah?" Eleanor translated, with the ease of someone accustomed to interpreting those who couldn't speak. "I was at the field hospital when they brought him in. Naomi was his nurse." Jackson's gaze swung to Naomi, disbelief and dawning recognition in his eyes. "Isaiah Emerson," Naomi said slowly, the name stirring memories long buried beneath more recent horrors. 23 years old, wounded at the Battle of Galveston, shot through the lung. She closed her eyes, recalling the young soldier's face. "He had your eyes." Jackson swayed slightly, overwhelmed by the connection he'd never imagined existed. Naomi had treated his brother in his final hours, and now, by some twist of fate or providence, their paths had crossed again in these remote hills. Eleanor watched the silent exchange with understanding. "This is no coincidence, Jackson. Isaiah made Naomi promise something before he died, didn't he?" Naomi nodded, the memory suddenly vivid. "He made me promise to find his brother if I ever passed through the hill country, said you'd be living alone somewhere, that you'd need someone to remind you the war was over." She looked at Jackson with new understanding. "I never had the chance to keep that promise, until now it seems." Jackson retrieved the slate with unsteady hands and wrote a single question. Was he in pain? The naked vulnerability in those 4 words broke something in Naomi's heart. "No," she said gently. "I made sure of that. He was at peace, Jackson. His last words were about you, that you'd be all right, that you were the strong one." Jackson turned away abruptly, moving to the window where the others couldn't see his face. His shoulders were rigid with the effort of containing emotion too powerful to express. Eleanor gave him a moment, then spoke softly. I wish we had time for proper reunions, but we don't. Thorne knows Naomi is alive and he won't stop until he finds her. Why? Naomi asked. What does he think I'll do? It's not what you'll do, Eleanor said grimly. It's what you know. She glanced at Jackson, who had turned back to listen. What you both know now, I suspect. Jackson raised an eyebrow in question. The brand, Eleanor explained. It's not just a mark of ownership. It's part of a pattern, a code. Each woman is marked differently in different places. Together, they form a map. A map to what? Naomi asked, her hand moving unconsciously to her thigh. To Thorne's real operation, Eleanor said. The one that made him rich during the war. The one that still protects him now that he's become respectable. She spat the last word like it tasted foul. Arms dealing, smuggling, murder for hire, all documented, all hidden. And the women are the key to finding this evidence, Naomi said slowly, understanding dawning. That's why he's so desperate to recover us all. We're literally marked with the location of his secrets. Eleanor nodded grimly. And why he kills any woman who tries to escape. Except you, Naomi. You got away. Not just me, Naomi said. There must be others. There are, Eleanor confirmed. I've helped 7 escape in the last year. Each one carries a piece of the puzzle. And she turned to Jackson. That's why I came to find you both. We need to bring them together. All the marked women. It's the only way to stop Thorne permanently. Jackson's expression darkened with doubt. He wrote quickly, too dangerous. Thorne has men everywhere. Yes, he does, Eleanor agreed, which is why we need your help, Jackson. You know these hills better than anyone. You can move without being seen, and you have military experience. Jackson shook his head firmly and wrote, I left the war behind. Did you, Eleanor challenged gently, or are you still fighting it alone in these hills? She gestured around the cabin. This isn't peace, Jackson. It's exile. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Please, Naomi said softly, I can't do this alone. Those women, they're like me, branded, hunted. They deserve a chance at freedom, at justice. Jackson wouldn't meet her eyes. He wrote one word. How Eleanor moved to the table, unfolding a crude map she withdrew from her pocket. First, we gather the survivors. They're scattered across 3 counties, hiding in plain sight. Then we piece together what they know, the locations, the evidence, everything. And then, Naomi pressed, then we take it to someone who can use it. A federal marshal, perhaps, or a newspaper in Austin. Eleanor's voice hardened. We make sure Thorne can never hurt anyone again. Jackson studied the map, his expression unreadable. Finally, he wrote, Thorne will kill to prevent this. Yes, Eleanor said simply, he will. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Outside, the morning mist had burned away, revealing a day of brilliant sunshine and clear blue skies. A mockingbird sang exuberantly from a nearby oak, oblivious to the weight of decision hanging in the human dwelling below. Jackson moved to a trunk in the corner of the room. Kneeling, he unlocked it and raised the lid, revealing neatly folded Union Army uniforms, a pair of service revolvers, and a leather case containing what appeared to be maps and documents. He hadn't just left the war behind, he'd packed it away, preserved it like a bitter memory too important to discard entirely. He turned to face the women, his decision written in the set of his shoulders. Does this mean you'll help us? Naomi asked, hope threading through her voice. Jackson nodded once, decisive. Then he wrote on the slate, for Isaiah, for you, for all of them. In that moment, as sunlight streamed through the cabin window and illuminated his weathered face, Naomi saw not just the silent mountain man who had saved her life, but the soldier he had once been. The brother who couldn't save Isaiah, but might yet save others in his name. Thank you, she whispered. Jackson gave her a solemn nod, then began removing items from the trunk, preparations for a battle he'd never expected to fight, but now embraced as his own. The war he'd tried to leave behind had found him again, but this time he wouldn't be fighting it alone. As evening fell, Jackson stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the first stars emerge in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Behind him, the cabin glowed with lamplight, silhouetting Naomi and Eleanor as they bent over maps and notes planning their dangerous undertaking. The day had passed in a flurry of preparation. Jackson had retrieved caches of supplies hidden throughout the hills, ammunition preserved, food, medical items. Weapons had been cleaned and checked, routes plotted, contingencies discussed. Throughout it all, a single question had gnawed at him, one he couldn't articulate even on his slate. Was he leading these women into danger for the right reasons? Was this truly about justice, or was it vengeance wearing virtue's mask? The sound of footsteps made him turn. Naomi approached, her limp less pronounced now, but still evident. She stood beside him, following his gaze to the emerging stars. Eleanor's resting, she said. Tomorrow will be difficult for her. Jackson nodded. The older woman would return to Bandera, continuing her role as the unassuming church caretaker while secretly contacting the other survivors. The risks she took daily humbled him. I never thanked Isaiah properly, Naomi said after a moment of shared silence, for what he did at Galveston. Jackson raised an eyebrow in question. He saved 3 other wounded men before he was shot, she explained, carried them from the battlefield under heavy fire. By the time they brought him to me, it was too late to do more than ease his passing. She glanced at Jackson. He spoke of you constantly, said his little brother was the real hero of the family. Jackson's expression tightened with emotion. He reached for the slate hanging at his belt and wrote, "He was wrong. I failed him." "How?" Naomi asked gently. "I wasn't there when he needed me. Different units, different battles." "The war separated so many," Naomi said. "You can't blame yourself for that." Jackson's writing became more forceful. "I promised our mother I would protect him. Last thing I said before we enlisted." Naomi was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of guilt he'd carried for so long. "Is that why you don't speak?" she finally asked. "Because of the promise you couldn't keep?" Jackson stared at the horizon, considering her question. After a long moment, he wrote partly. "After Isaiah died, words seemed pointless, empty. What good are words against bullets, against death?" "And the other part?" Naomi pressed gently. Jackson hesitated, then wrote slowly. "I hear things differently now. The world is clearer without my voice in it." Naomi nodded, understanding dawning. "You listen instead of speak." "Yes. And in listening, I've learned more than I ever did by talking." They stood in companionable silence as full darkness settled over the hills. The night air carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant song of cicadas. Above them, stars multiplied like diamond dust scattered across black velvet. "Do you think we can succeed?" Naomi asked, finally voicing the doubt that had shadowed her throughout the day's preparations. Against Thorne, against all his men and influence. Jackson considered her question carefully before writing, "I think we must try. For Isaiah. For the women who didn't escape. For you." "For me," Naomi echoed, surprise. Jackson nodded, then wrote, "You saved my brother's final hours. Now I save your future ones." The simple declaration stole Naomi's breath. In Jackson's precise script was a promise as binding as any oath, a commitment to her well-being that asked nothing in return. "What about your future hours?" she asked softly. "What happens to Jackson Emerson when this is over?" He gave her a small, sad smile and wrote, "Never plan that far ahead. One day at a time." Naomi's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool against his calloused palm. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "we could plan together when this is over." Jackson looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face illuminated by starlight. He seemed about to write something, then reconsidered tucking the slate away. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture containing possibilities neither of them had dared imagine until this moment. As they turned to walk back to the cabin, Jackson noticed something he'd missed before. Naomi stood straighter now, her shoulders no longer hunched in perpetual anticipation of threat. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes since her arrival had softened. She wasn't healed, not completely. Neither of them was. But in finding common purpose, they had discovered something precious, the first fragile tendrils of hope taking root in the broken ground of their lives. It was enough, Jackson thought, to face whatever came next. One day at a time together. The creek gurgled softly over the smooth stones, its voice a gentle counterpoint to the breeze rustling through new spring leaves. Naomi knelt at the water's edge, her reflection wavering in the current as she filled a canteen. A week had passed since Eleanor's visit, a week of preparation and waiting for word from Bandera. The isolation that had once seemed like safety now felt like suspension, a holding of breath before the plunge into unknown depths. Movement on the opposite bank caught her attention. A doe stepped delicately to the water, her soft brown eyes alert for danger as she lowered her muzzle to drink. Naomi remained perfectly still, unwilling to disturb the moment of natural grace. So intent was she on the deer that she didn't hear Jackson's approach until he was beside her, his footsteps deliberately audible to avoid startling her. The doe's head snapped up, ears pivoting toward them before she bounded back into the forest in a fluid leap. "She was beautiful," Naomi said softly. Jackson nodded, then held out his slate rider coming. From the south, instantly alert, Naomi rose to her feet, her hand moving to the small revolver Jackson had insisted she carry. "Thorne's men." Jackson shook his head and wrote single rider, moving openly, not trying to hide. That meant either someone who posed no threat or someone supremely confident in their ability to handle any threat they encountered. Neither possibility was entirely reassuring. "Eleanor," Naomi suggested hopefully, too soon for her return. Jackson gestured toward the cabin, his meaning clear. They should wait there where defensive positions were established and escape routes planned. They moved quickly through the forest, Jackson leading the way with the silent confidence of a man traversing familiar terrain. As they reached the clearing, he motioned for Naomi to enter the cabin while he took position behind a large oak rifle ready. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then came the sound of hoofbeats approaching at an unhurried pace. A horse nickered softly, sensing the cabin's clearing ahead. "Hello, the house," called a man's voice, deep and cautious. "I'm looking for Jackson Emerson." Jackson remained hidden, his finger resting lightly on the rifle's trigger. Few people knew his name, fewer still his location. "My name is Matthew Wilson," the voice continued. "I'm the doctor from Bandera. Eleanor Martin sent me." Inside the cabin, Naomi moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. A man sat astride a chestnut gelding at the forest's edge, middle-aged with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a dark coat and carried a leather medical bag every inch the country doctor. "He looks legitimate," she called softly to Jackson. "Should I speak to him?" Jackson shook his head firmly, then gestured for her to stay inside. Emerging from his hiding place, he approached the rider with his rifle lowered but ready. Dr. Wilson raised his hand slightly. "Mr. Emerson, I presume Eleanor said you were cautious." He reached slowly into his coat pocket. "I have a letter from her. May I?" Jackson nodded once, watching intently as Wilson withdrew a folded paper sealed with wax. "She said to tell you that Isaiah would be proud," Wilson added. "She said you'd understand." Something in Jackson's expression softened at the mention of his brother's name. He took the letter, breaking the seal with his thumb. The handwriting inside was neat and feminine. "Jackson, Dr. Wilson is trustworthy. He has treated 3 of our survivors and kept their secrets. He brings news too dangerous to commit to paper. 4 days from now, Thorne travels to Austin. It may be our only opportunity." With hope, Eleanor Jackson studied the letter, then the man who had delivered it. Finally, he nodded toward the cabin, inviting Wilson to dismount and enter. "Thank you," the doctor said, swinging down from his horse with the ease of a man accustomed to rural house calls. "I've ridden a long way, and these old bones aren't what they once were." Inside, Naomi had already put water on to boil, anticipating the need for coffee or tea after the doctor's journey. Her medical training made her instinctively hospitable to a fellow practitioner, though caution still shadowed her movements. "Miss Wallace," Wilson said, removing his hat as he entered, "Eleanor told me about you. I'm glad to see you recovering well." "You know who I am?" Naomi asked, tension evident in her voice. "I know you're a nurse who escaped Thorne's compound," Wilson replied carefully, "and I know about the brand." His eyes reflected genuine compassion. "I've treated others like you." "How many?" Naomi asked. "7 that I know of," Wilson said, accepting the cup of tea she offered. "Though I suspect there are more who haven't sought medical attention." Jackson had been watching the exchange silently. Now he retrieved his slate and wrote Eleanor's letter mentioned Austin. "Explain." Wilson sipped his tea before answering. "Thorne is traveling to the capital in 4 days' time. He has a meeting with the governor, something about a railroad contract. It's the first time in months he'll be away from his compound and his men." "An opportunity," Naomi said, understanding immediately. "Precisely," Wilson agreed. "While he's gone, we could access his office, find the evidence you need." Jackson frowned and wrote, "Too convenient. Could be a trap." "I thought the same," Wilson admitted. "But Eleanor has a source inside Thorne's operations, someone who's been feeding her information for months. The same person who helped Naomi escape." Naomi's head snapped up in surprise. "Someone helped me. I thought I got away on my own." Wilson shook his head. The gate was left unlocked deliberately. The guards were distracted at the critical moment. He studied her reaction. "You truly didn't know?" "No," Naomi said softly, recalling the night of her escape, the unexpected ease with which she'd slipped past the normal patrols, the strange absence of dogs that usually roamed the compound perimeter. "Who would risk that for me?" "Eleanor wouldn't say," Wilson replied, "for their protection as much as ours." Jackson had been listening intently. He wrote, "This informant, can they be trusted? Eleanor trusts them," Wilson said simply, "and I trust Eleanor." Jackson nodded thoughtfully, then wrote, "When Thorne is in Austin, how many men remain at the compound?" 8, perhaps 10, Wilson replied. "Half his usual contingent. The others will accompany him to the capital." Naomi and Jackson exchanged a glance, the same thought clearly occurring to both of them. "We could free the other women," Naomi said, giving voice to their shared realization. "While Thorne is away, we could get them all out." Wilson nodded gravely. "That's Eleanor's plan, but it's incredibly dangerous. Even with reduced numbers, Thorne's men are armed and ruthless." Jackson wrote decisively. "So are we." He underlined the words twice, his expression leaving no doubt about his commitment to the plan. "Eleanor thought you might say that," Wilson said with a small smile. "She's already begun preparations. The church basement has been stocked with supplies. I've arranged medical care. If when you bring the women out, we'll be ready." Naomi felt a surge of hope, so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. The possibility of freeing others from the nightmare she'd escaped, of ensuring they never had to endure what she had, it was worth any risk. "What do you need from us?" she asked Wilson. "Initially information, layout of the compound, guard rotations, potential obstacles." He turned to Jackson. "Eleanor said you were a scout during the war. That kind of expertise will be invaluable." Jackson nodded once, acknowledging the assessment. He wrote, "I'll need to see the compound myself tonight." "Is that wise?" Naomi questioned, concern evident in her voice. "If you're caught," Jackson cut her off with a firm shake of his head. He wrote, "Won't be caught. Need to see what we're facing." "He's right," Wilson said to Naomi. "Proper reconnaissance is essential." He reached into his bag and withdrew a folded paper. "This is a rough map of the area based on what Eleanor and the other survivors have told me. It's incomplete, but it's a start." Jackson took the map, studying it with the practiced eye of a military scout. His finger traced the main approach to the compound, then the surrounding terrain, his expression thoughtful. "There's something else you should know," Wilson said, his voice dropping. "Something Eleanor discovered only recently." He glanced between Naomi and Jackson. "Thorne isn't working alone. He has protection, powerful protection." "From whom?" Naomi asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "The new territorial governor," Wilson said grimly. "They served together during the war. Now Thorne provides him with certain services in exchange for political cover." The implications were clear and disturbing. Their enemy wasn't just a local tyrant, but a man with connections reaching to the highest levels of post-war authority. Jackson wrote a single blunt question. "Does that change anything for you?" Wilson smiled thinly. "I've been treating freed slaves and Mexican laborers for free since before the war, Mr. Emerson. I'm well accustomed to being on the wrong side of those in power." Jackson studied the doctor's face, apparently satisfied with what he saw there. He nodded once in respect, then turned to the map again, his mind already plotting approaches and escape routes. Naomi watched him, struck by the transformation that had occurred over the past days. The solitary man who had pulled her from the creek had become a strategist, a leader, the soldier his brother had known. His isolation had been a cocoon, not a tomb. Within it, he had not died, but waited, gathering strength for a purpose he hadn't yet recognized. As the three of them bent over the map, planning an assault on a fortress of cruelty, Naomi felt a strange sense of rightness descend. This was why she had survived. This was why Jackson had found her. This moment, this mission, this chance to turn their individual suffering into collective liberation. For the first time since escaping Thorne's compound, Naomi felt something beyond fear, beyond mere survival. She felt purpose as clear and bright as the North Star. And in Jackson's eyes, she saw the same certainty reflected back at her. The moon hung low over the western hills, a waning crescent that offered just enough light to navigate by while still cloaking movement in shadow. Jackson crouched in the branches of an ancient oak, his body perfectly still as he studied the compound below through a small brass spyglass. The place was well situated from a defensive perspective, a converted ranch house surrounded by outbuildings, all enclosed within a high wooden fence. Two men patrolled the perimeter with lanterns, while a third watched from a platform near the main gate. Dogs would normally have been a concern, but Jackson had come prepared with meat laced with laudanum, a trick he'd learned during the war for silencing guard dogs without harming them permanently. For 2 hours, he'd observed the routine of the night guards, noting the timing of their rounds, the duration of their breaks, the moments when attention wavered. The discipline was poor by military standards. These were hired thugs, not soldiers but numbers, and armament compensated for lack of training. Movement near the main house caught his attention. A man emerged onto the porch, tall and commanding, even at this distance. Even without the spyglass, Jackson would have recognized Caleb Thorne's distinctive bearing. The man stood for a moment surveying his domain, then descended the steps to speak with one of the guards. Jackson adjusted the spyglass, bringing Thorne's face into sharp focus. In the lamplight, the scar that ran from temple to brow appeared livid against his skin, pulling his mouth into a permanent half-sneer. He was handsome in the way of predators, all sleek lines and contained power, his every gesture calculated for effect. As Jackson watched, Thorne issued instructions to the guard, who nodded repeatedly, his body language deferential to the point of servility. When Thorne turned to re-enter the house, the guard's posture relaxed visibly, tension draining from his shoulders. "Fear not loyalty," Jackson noted. "Useful information." A slight sound from below fabric brushing against bark made Jackson tense momentarily. But it was only Naomi who had insisted on accompanying him despite his objections. She had argued that her knowledge of the compound's interior would be invaluable, and in the end he had relented, recognizing the truth in her assertion. Now she climbed carefully to join him on the broad limb, her movements deliberate and silent. Jackson made space for her, impressed despite himself at how quickly she had adapted to the requirements of stealth. She had natural ability, this nurse, with her steady hands and watchful eyes. Naomi settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his as she peered toward the compound. He passed her the spyglass without prompting. "There are more guards than when I escaped," she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. "And they've reinforced the gate." Jackson nodded, having noted the same details. He retrieved a small notebook and pencil from his pocket, more practical than the slate for field observations, and wrote, "Responding to your escape. Expecting rescue attempt." Naomi considered this studying the compound through the spyglass again. Possibly, or preparing for another escape. She lowered the glass, her expression troubled. "The women are kept in the old bunkhouse there." She pointed to a long, low building on the compound's eastern side. "Barred windows, one door always guarded." "How many women when I was there? 14. Naomi's voice tightened with emotion. "Young mostly, some barely more than girls." Jackson's jaw clenched at the thought. He wrote, "Armed inside. The guards carry revolvers. There's a rifle rack in the main house, 10 or 12 weapons, kept locked." She hesitated, then added, "Thorne keeps a shotgun in his office, and a Derringer in his boot." Jackson raised an eyebrow, impressed with her observational skills. "Many soldiers notice less. You would have made a good scout," he wrote. A ghost of a smile touched Naomi's lips. "I've always been observant, useful in nursing. Notice the symptoms others miss." They fell silent as a guard passed directly beneath their position, the brim of his hat visible as he scanned the darkness beyond the fence. Jackson and Naomi remained motionless until he moved on, resuming his patrol with the bored gait of a man who expected no trouble. Sloppy Jackson wrote when it was safe. Predictable routines, no perimeter checks. Overconfident, Naomi agreed. They believed no one would dare challenge Thorne's authority. Their mistake. Naomi studied Jackson's face in the dim moonlight, noting the cold determination in his eyes. This was not the solitary hermit who had pulled her from the creek, but the soldier he had once been, focused, calculating, deadly when necessary. "We really are going to do this, aren't we?" she whispered. "Free them all." Jackson nodded, once his expression softening slightly as he gazed at her. He wrote, "No one deserves what was done to you. To them." Naomi touched the brand on her thigh through the fabric of her borrowed trousers. "No," she agreed softly. "They don't." They observed for another hour, recording guard changes and noting potential weaknesses in the compound security. When clouds began to obscure the moon, they descended from the oak and melted into the surrounding forest, two shadows among many in the Texas night. As they made their way back to the cabin, Naomi found herself studying Jackson's profile in the intermittent moonlight. The silent man who had saved her life had become something more in the days since: a partner, a protector, perhaps even a friend. What would he become in the days ahead, she wondered, when blood was shed and lives hung in the balance? And what would she become, this woman who had once sworn to heal, now planning an assault that would inevitably cause harm? Necessary harm, she reminded herself. Justice, not vengeance. But as the cabin came into view, a small island of warmth in the vast darkness of the hill country, Naomi wondered if she was trying to convince herself of a distinction without a difference. Some wounds she knew better than most were necessary before healing could begin. The creek reflected the midnight sky like polished obsidian stars trembling on its surface as if uncertain of their place in the universe. Naomi sat on a flat rock at the water's edge, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the heavens revolve slowly overhead. Sleep had eluded her since returning from the reconnaissance mission. Too many thoughts chased each other through her mind, too many emotions churned beneath her carefully maintained composure. Tomorrow Wilson would return with final preparations for the rescue attempt. Tomorrow everything would be set in motion for better or worse. The sound of soft footsteps approaching didn't startle her. She had grown accustomed to Jackson's silent presence, the way he moved through the world with deliberate care, as if afraid of disturbing its fragile balance. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked without turning. Jackson settled beside her on the rock, his larger frame radiating warmth in the cool night air. He held out his slate, old habit before battle. "Stay awake. Think. Prepare. Is that what this is, a battle?" Jackson considered her question, then wrote, "Yes. Different enemy, same stakes. Life, death, freedom." Naomi nodded slowly. "I've never been in battle before, not directly. I always came after when the fighting was done and the suffering began." "You've seen worse than most soldiers." "Different, not worse," Naomi corrected gently. "You can't compare suffering. It just is." They sat in companionable silence for a time, listening to the creek's quiet murmur and the distant call of a whippoorwill. The night was alive around them, countless creatures going about their business in the darkness, unconcerned with human struggles. "Are you afraid?" Naomi finally asked, voicing the question that had haunted her own thoughts. Jackson didn't answer immediately. When he did write, his honesty was disarming. "Always afraid before battle. Anyone who isn't is a fool or a liar." "What do you do with the fear?" "Acknowledge it. Accept it. Use it. Fear keeps you sharp." Naomi smiled slightly. "You sound like my father. He was a doctor in Philadelphia. He always said fear was just the body's way of preparing for challenge." Jackson nodded, writing wise man. Naomi agreed, her smile fading. "He died early in the war. Typhoid outbreak in a field hospital. He could have stayed in Philadelphia safe in his practice, but he volunteered." She stared into the darkness. "He believed in healing without regard for uniform color or political conviction. You followed his example." "I tried," Naomi said softly. "Though I wonder what he would think of me now, planning violence instead of healing." Jackson's response came quickly. "Sometimes cutting is necessary before healing can begin. Surgeons know this." Naomi considered his words, finding unexpected comfort in them. "Yes," she acknowledged, "they do." Jackson studied her profile in the starlight, then wrote hesitantly, "May I ask something personal?" Naomi nodded, curious about what this habitually private man might want to know. "How did Thorne capture you, a nurse with your experience?" He left the question unfinished, but his meaning was clear. How had someone as capable as Naomi fallen into such a trap? She sighed, the memory still painful despite the passage of time. "I was naive. After the war, I stayed in Texas because the need was so great. When Thorne approached me about the supposed typhoid outbreak, I saw only a chance to help, not a carefully laid trap." Her voice hardened. "By the time I realized the truth, I was already at the compound, my possessions confiscated, my credentials destroyed." "You tried to help the women." "I did what little I could, treated their injuries, offered comfort." Her hand moved unconsciously to her thigh. "When Thorne realized I was encouraging resistance rather than submission, he decided to make an example of me." Jackson's expression darkened with anger. He wrote, "He will answer for that. For all of it. Justice, not vengeance." Naomi reminded him gently. "Sometimes they're the same." She shook her head. "No, Jackson, they're not. Vengeance perpetuates the cycle. Justice ends it." He considered her words, then conceded with a nod. After a moment, he wrote, "What will you do, Madam?" The question caught Naomi off guard. She had been so focused on the immediate challenge of freeing the women that she had given little thought to what might come next. "I don't know," she admitted. "Return to nursing, perhaps, though my credentials are gone, or maybe—" She hesitated, then continued, "Maybe find a small town that needs medical care. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere I could build something new." Jackson nodded thoughtfully, then wrote, "You would be good at that. Building something new." "What about you?" Naomi asked. "Will you return to your solitude here?" Jackson stared at the creek for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Finally, he wrote, "Never thought beyond the next day, the next meal, the next sunset. And now I remember there are things worth fighting for, worth living for." He glanced at her, then quickly away, as if embarrassed by the admission. Naomi felt a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with the night air. "Perhaps," she said softly, "we could both find out what comes next, together." Jackson looked at her, surprise and something more vulnerable evident in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he set aside the slate and took her hand in his. His palm was calloused from years of self-sufficient living, but his touch was gentle, almost reverent. For a long moment they sat with their fingers intertwined, no words needed between them. In that simple contact was a promise neither was ready to voice, but both understood, a commitment to possibilities beyond survival, beyond justice, beyond the wounds that had shaped them. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. The creek continued its eternal journey toward distant seas, and two people who had known too much of isolation found in each other's presence a peace neither had thought to experience again. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something more tentative, more fragile, a recognition of kindred spirits, a mutual decision to face whatever came next, with one hand clasped firmly in another's. For now, it was enough. Dawn arrived with a curtain of mist that clung to the limestone hills, transforming the familiar landscape into something dreamlike and uncertain. Jackson stood at the cabin door, watching as the world gradually solidified around him, trees and rocks emerging from the haze like memories taking shape. Today would set everything in motion. Wilson would return with final instructions from Eleanor. The rescue attempt would be planned in detail. There would be no turning back. Behind him, Naomi slept on his cot, her face relaxed in slumber, one arm curled protectively over her side. In sleep, the tension that normally tightened her features was absent, revealing the woman she might have been without Thorne's cruelty. Younger, softer, unguarded. Jackson turned away uncomfortable with his own observations. Since their conversation by the creek, something had shifted between them. A boundary crossed, a distance closed. Her hand in his had felt right in a way few things had since the war ended. But with that rightness came responsibility, and with responsibility, fear. Not for himself, but for her. The mist parted briefly, revealing a rider approaching through the trees. Jackson tensed, reaching for his rifle before recognizing the silhouette of Dr. Wilson on his chestnut gelding. The doctor rode slowly, one hand on the reins, the other supporting a second figure. Seated behind him, a woman, her face hidden beneath a shawl. Jackson stepped into the clearing, rifle lowered but ready. As the horse drew closer, the woman looked up, and recognition flashed through him like lightning. He knew that face, older, more careworn than in his memory, but unmistakable. Eleanor Martin. The church caretaker had risked coming herself rather than sending Wilson alone. Something significant had changed. Jackson moved forward to help Eleanor dismount, her slight weight barely registering as he lifted her down. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into her features, the shadows beneath her eyes suggesting sleepless nights. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," she said softly. "But circumstances have forced our hand." Jackson raised an eyebrow in question, then glanced toward the cabin where Naomi still slept. "Let her rest," Eleanor said. "She'll need her strength." She nodded toward a fallen log at the clearing's edge. "May we speak privately first?" Jackson led her to the log, then retrieved his slate from his belt. "What's happened? Thorne's plans have changed," Eleanor said without preamble. "He's leaving for Austin today, not 4 days from now. A telegram arrived yesterday. The governor has summoned him urgently." Jackson frowned, writing, "How do you know this, my source?" Eleanor replied. "The same one who helped Naomi escape." "Can they be trusted?" Eleanor's expression hardened slightly. "With my life. And yours." She hesitated, then added, "It's my son, Jackson. Luther Reeves is my son." Jackson's surprise must have shown on his face, for Eleanor continued quickly. "Not by birth. I took him in after the war when he was broken in body and spirit. Nursed him back to health." Her voice softened with maternal pride. "He infiltrated Thorne's operation 6 months ago after we realized what was happening to the women. Dangerous position." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and now he's in even greater danger. Thorne suspects a traitor in his ranks. The noose is tightening." She leaned forward, urgency in every line of her body. "We must act tonight while Thorne is away, but before he realizes Luther's role." Jackson wrote carefully, "Tonight gives little time to prepare. I know, but it may be our only chance." Eleanor reached into her shawl and withdrew a folded paper. "Luther sent this, the guard rotation for tonight. Only 6 men will remain at the compound. The others accompany Thorne to Austin." Jackson studied the paper, his military mind automatically analyzing weaknesses, opportunities, risks. It could work. With surprise on their side and proper planning, it could work. "How many women to evacuate?" 11, Eleanor said, "plus 2 children born in captivity." Jackson's jaw tightened at this new information. Children. The stakes had just risen considerably. "Weapons, Matthew has procured 6 rifles and ammunition, not military grade, but serviceable, and Luther will ensure the compound's rifle rack is unlocked." "Transport. 3 wagons waiting at the church. From there, the women will travel north in smaller groups. The Underground Railroad didn't end with slavery, Jackson. Its routes and safe houses still exist for those in need." Jackson nodded, thoughtfully impressed with the thoroughness of Eleanor's planning. This was no impulsive rescue attempt, but a carefully coordinated operation with multiple contingencies. And Thorne's evidence, Luther believes it's in a safe in Thorne's office. He doesn't know the combination, but... She glanced toward the cabin. "One of the women might. Each brand contains part of the sequence, remember?" Jackson nodded, writing, "Naomi's brand is part of it." "Yes, and together with the others, it may be enough to open the safe and expose Thorne's entire operation." Eleanor's expression turned grim. "It's not just trafficking, Jackson. There's arms dealing, bribery of officials, even murder for hire. Thorne has built a small empire on human suffering. Tonight we bring it down." Eleanor studied his face, noting the cold determination in his eyes. "Yes," she agreed softly, "we do." The cabin door opened and Naomi emerged, blinking in the brightening daylight. Seeing Eleanor, she hurried forward, embracing the older woman with genuine affection. "Eleanor, I didn't expect you to come yourself." "Circumstances demanded it, my dear." Eleanor briefly explained the change in plans, watching as Naomi's expression shifted from surprise to resolve. Tonight, Naomi repeated, her hand unconsciously moving to her thigh where the brand lay hidden. Then we have much to prepare. As Wilson joined them, leading his horse to the small lean-to that served as Jackson's stable, the four conspirators moved into the cabin to begin planning in earnest. Maps were spread on the table, weapons checked, and distributed, roles assigned. Jackson would lead the assault team himself, Wilson, and two men Eleanor trusted from Bandera. Naomi would focus on treating any injured women and preparing them for transport. Eleanor would coordinate from the church, ensuring the escape route remained clear. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist, the plan took final shape. It wasn't perfect. No battle plan ever was, as Jackson well knew. But it was sound. With luck and proper execution, they might free the captives with minimal bloodshed. But as Jackson caught Naomi's eye across the table, he saw his own unspoken thought reflected there. In war, luck was as fickle as the Texas weather, and even the best plans rarely survive first contact with the enemy. The day passed with the strange, suspended quality that often precedes momentous events. Each hour seemed both interminable and fleeting, the sun's arc across the sky simultaneously too slow and too fast. Wilson had departed shortly after the planning session, returning to Bandera to prepare the church and alert the other rescuers. Eleanor remained at the cabin, resting in preparation for the night ahead, while Jackson and Naomi made their final arrangements. Jackson had spent the afternoon preparing weapons and equipment with methodical precision. Each rifle was cleaned and loaded, each knife sharpened, each rope coiled and secured. His movements were unhurried, yet efficient, those of a man who had done this many times before, and understood that thoroughness now meant survival later. Naomi focused on medical preparations, assembling bandages, herbal poultices, and what few medicines she had available. Her hands moved with the same practiced confidence as Jackson's, her mind cataloging potential injuries and their treatments with clinical detachment. It was only as twilight approached, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of gold and amber, that the weight of what they were attempting fully descended on them. Naomi found Jackson at the creek, kneeling in the shallows as he filled canteens for the journey ahead. Without speaking, she joined him, her presence acknowledged with a slight nod. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked softly, giving voice to the doubt that had shadowed her throughout the day. Jackson set aside the canteens and reached for his slate. "You're having second thoughts, not about freeing the women," Naomi clarified. "Never that, but the risk." She looked at him directly. "People could die tonight, Jackson, because of our actions. People are already dying, slowly, in captivity." "I know," she sighed. I took an oath as a nurse. To heal, not harm." Jackson considered her words carefully before writing, "Some infections require surgical intervention. Painful but necessary." Naomi smiled faintly at his continued use of medical metaphors. "And you're the surgeon in this scenario. We all are, cutting out disease so healing can begin." She nodded slowly, finding comfort in his straightforward logic. "And afterward, what then?" Jackson hesitated, then wrote, "One step at a time. First we free them, then we ensure Thorn can never hurt anyone again. The rest—" He paused, his pencil hovering over the slate. Something in his expression made Naomi reach for his hand, stilling it. "The rest we'll figure out together," she finished for him. Jackson's eyes met hers, gratitude and something deeper reflecting in their depths. He nodded once, a gesture conveying more than words could have expressed. The moment was interrupted by Eleanor's voice, calling from the cabin. "It's time. Wilson has returned with the wagons." The fragile bubble of intimacy burst reality, reasserting itself with cold clarity. Jackson rose, gathering the filled canteens with efficient movements. Naomi stood more slowly, aware that whatever happened in the hours ahead would irrevocably change the path of her life, their lives. As they walked back to the cabin side by side, shoulders occasionally brushing, Naomi felt a curious sense of rightness descend. Fear remained, yes, but beneath it lay bedrock certainty. This was necessary. This was just. This was the purpose for which she had survived Thorn's cruelty. The time for doubt had passed. Now came action, and with it, the possibility of redemption. Night fell like a velvet curtain over the hill, country stars emerging one by one, until the sky blazed with their cold, distant light. No moon rose to complicate matters, a new moon hidden in shadow offering perfect darkness for their approach. Jackson led the small party through the forest with the sure-footed confidence of a man navigating familiar terrain. Behind him moved Wilson, then two men from Bandera, Thomas and Samuel, both former soldiers who had known Eleanor's son during the war. Naomi brought up the rear, dressed in men's clothing for freedom of movement, her medical bag slung across her body. They moved in silence, each step placed with care, each breath measured. The only sounds were the whisper of fabric against leaves and the occasional call of a night bird undisturbed by their passing. As they neared the compound, Jackson signaled for a halt. Ahead, lamplight glowed behind the high wooden fence, creating islands of illumination in the surrounding darkness. Guards moved between these pools of light, their shadows elongated against the ground. Jackson retrieved a small piece of slate from his pocket. Not his usual one, but a smaller version prepared specifically for tonight's operation. Using a stub of chalk, he sketched a quick diagram of the compound's layout, refreshing everyone's memory of their assigned positions and tasks. The plan was straightforward, in concept complex in execution. Thomas and Samuel would create a diversion at the south fence controlled fire designed to draw guards away from the bunkhouse. Wilson would cover the main gate, preventing escape or reinforcement. Jackson would enter through the east side, where Luther had promised to weaken a section of fence. Naomi would follow once Jackson had secured the path to the bunkhouse. Jackson caught Naomi's gaze, his expression asking a final silent question. "Ready." She nodded once her face calmed, despite the fear he knew she must be feeling. Returning to the place of her captivity and torture required a courage few possessed. With a gesture indicating they should proceed, Jackson led them closer to the compound's perimeter. At the edge of the tree line, they separated, each moving to their assigned position with the coordinated precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Jackson approached the eastern fence alone, keeping to the deepest shadows. According to Luther's information, only one guard patrolled this section, the least experienced of Thorne's men, assigned to what was considered the least vulnerable approach. The guard appeared right on schedule, moving with the bored gait of someone performing a routine task. Young, barely out of boyhood, with a revolver too large for his narrow frame and a nervous habit of adjusting his hat every few steps. Jackson waited until the guard passed, then moved swiftly to the fence. As promised, 3 boards had been loosened, creating a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if the boards were removed. Working silently, Jackson extracted the boards and set them aside, then slipped through the opening into the compound. He pressed himself against the inner fence, becoming one with the shadows, as the guard completed his circuit and approached again. The young man passed within 3 feet of Jackson's position without noticing the intruder or the breach in the fence. Once the guard moved on, Jackson surveyed the compound's interior. The main house stood dark except for a single lamp burning in what appeared to be an office. The bunkhouse, some 50 yards away, was illuminated, a guard stationed at its door. Between Jackson's position and his objective lay an open space, exposed and dangerous. Before he could move, the night erupted with noise and light from the southern perimeter. Thomas and Samuel had initiated their diversion, a series of small explosions followed by flames climbing the fence. Shouts rang out as guards rushed toward the disturbance, exactly as planned. Jackson seized the opportunity, sprinting across the open ground toward the bunkhouse. The guard at the door hesitated, torn between maintaining his post and responding to the apparent attack. That moment of indecision cost him dearly. Jackson closed the distance before the man could raise his weapon, striking him with the butt of his rifle with calculated force enough to render unconscious, not to kill. As the guard crumpled, Jackson caught his body, lowering it silently to the ground. He glanced back toward the fence breach, seeing Naomi's silhouette already slipping through. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then the bunkhouse door opened. A man stepped out, not one of the regular guards, but Luther Reeves himself, his scarred face immediately recognizable in the lamplight. He froze at the sight of Jackson standing over the unconscious guard hand, instinctively moving toward his holstered revolver. Jackson raised his rifle but didn't fire. Something in Luther's posture spoke not of threat, but of recognition. "Emerson," Luther said softly. "Right on time." Jackson nodded once, lowering his weapon slightly, but remaining wary. "The women are ready," Luther continued, keeping his voice low. "I told them help was coming." He glanced toward the southern disturbance, where guards could be seen silhouetted against growing flames. "Your diversion worked. Most of the men are occupied." Naomi appeared at Jackson's side, slightly breathless from her sprint across the compound. "Luther," she acknowledged with cautious respect. "Miss Wallace?" Luther nodded. "Glad to see you well." He turned back to the bunkhouse door. "We should hurry. Once they realize the fire is a diversion, they'll return." Inside the bunkhouse, oil lamps cast wavering light over a scene that made Jackson's jaw tighten with controlled fury. The long room was divided into small cells formed by iron bars, each containing narrow cots where women sat or stood, their faces a study in mingled hope and terror. At Luther's appearance with the strangers, several women shrank back. Others moved forward, hands gripping the bars of their cages with white-knuckled intensity. "It's all right," Luther called softly. "They're here to help, just as I promised." From a ring at his belt, he produced a key which he used to unlock the first cell. The woman inside, young with haunted eyes and a fading bruise on her cheek, hesitated only briefly before rushing out. "Naomi," she gasped, recognition dawning as she saw her fellow escapee. "Sarah?" Naomi embraced her quickly. "We're getting you all out, tonight." As Luther moved from cell to cell, unlocking each in turn, Naomi spoke to the women in a low, urgent voice, explaining the plan for evacuation. Jackson stood guard at the door, rifle ready, watching for any sign that the remaining guards had realized the Southern attack was merely a diversion. The women gathered their few possessions with the efficiency of those accustomed to sudden upheaval. Some helped others who moved more slowly due to injury, illness, or the advanced stages of pregnancy. Two small children, perhaps 3 and 5 years old, clung to their mothers with wide, frightened eyes. Jackson felt rage building in his chest at the sight of these innocents caught in Thorne's web of exploitation. He forced the emotion down, channeling it into heightened alertness. Anger clouded judgment, and clear judgment was essential now. "Everyone follow Naomi," Luther instructed the assembled women. "She'll lead you to the east fence where the doctor is waiting. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back." "What about Thorne's office?" Naomi asked. "The evidence." "I'll handle that," Luther said firmly. "You get them to safety." Jackson caught Luther's arm, shaking his head. On his small slate, he wrote, "Too dangerous, alone." "I'll come." Luther hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but we move fast." Jackson turned to Naomi, their eyes meeting in silent communication. She understood his decision, though concern shadowed her features. "Be careful," she whispered. "Both of you." With a final nod to Luther, Jackson followed the scarred man out of the bunkhouse and across the compound toward the main house. Behind them, Naomi began leading the freed women toward the eastern fence breach, keeping to the shadows as much as possible with such a large group. The diversion at the southern fence continued to occupy most of the guards, but it wouldn't last much longer. Already one man had broken away from the group, moving toward the bunkhouse with purposeful strides. Luther saw him too. "Go," he hissed to Jackson. "I'll delay him." Before Jackson could protest, Luther stepped out into the open, calling to the approaching guard with casual authority. "Jenkins Thorne wants everyone at the south fence. Could be raiders." The guard hesitated, then changed direction, jogging toward the commotion without questioning Luther's order. Luther rejoined Jackson with a tight smile. Being Thorne's right-hand man has its advantages, for now. They reached the main house without further incident, entering through a side door that Luther unlocked with another key from his ring. Inside the house was eerily quiet, the hallway illuminated only by a single oil lamp turned low. Luther led the way to Thorne's office, moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the layout. The door was locked, but another key solved that problem. Inside, the office spoke of its owner's character. Everything arranged with military precision, not a paper out of place, not a speck of dust visible on the polished surfaces. "The safe is behind that painting," Luther said, pointing to a large landscape of the Texas hill country that hung on the far wall. Jackson moved the painting aside, revealing a substantial iron safe set into the wall. Its dial gleamed dully in the lamplight, awaiting the combination that would unlock its secrets. "This is where we have a problem," Luther admitted. "I don't know the combination. Thorne never trusted anyone with it." Jackson studied the safe thoughtfully, then wrote on his slate. "Each woman's brand contains part of the sequence. That's what Eleanor believes," Luther confirmed. "But there's no way to know which parts or in what order." Jackson considered this, then wrote Naomi's brand, "A circle with a T at its center," Luther recited, "located on her right thigh." Jackson nodded, recalling the brand he'd seen when treating Naomi's wound. He wrote, "What about the others? Different symbols, different locations," Luther said. "I've seen most of them during my time here." An idea formed in Jackson's mind. He sketched quickly on the slate, drawing a crude representation of Naomi's brand, then added question marks for the others. Luther caught on immediately. "You think the brands themselves form the combination?" He frowned in concentration, then began describing each woman's brand from memory, their locations, their distinctive features. As he spoke, Jackson noted each description, arranging them in various configurations. If the brands were indeed parts of a code, there must be a logical sequence, perhaps based on the order in which the women were marked or their ages, or a pattern emerged from the descriptions. 6 brands were unique, different from all the others. 6 women who had been marked first, according to Luther. 6 numbers in a standard safe combination. Jackson wrote out the pattern, showing it to Luther. Circle with T Naomi, 15. T is 20th letter, minus 5 points in circle star. With X Sarah equals 24. X is 24th letter. Triangle with B. Mariah is 2B, is 2nd letter, square with H. Eleanor's description equals 8. H is 8th letter. Tiaman with R. Rebecca equals 18. R is 18th letter. Hexagon with F. Johanna equals 6. F is 5th letter. Luther stared at the slate, then at Jackson, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. "You think Thorne used a cipher based on the alphabet?" Jackson nodded. It was consistent with military encoding practices, simple enough to remember, complex enough to deter casual attempts. Worth trying, Luther agreed. He approached the safe, turning the dial carefully, as Jackson called out the sequence: right to 50 left, to 24 right, to the left, to 8 right, to the left, to 6. The final number clicked into place. Luther grasped the handle and turned. Nothing happened. Damn, Luther muttered. It didn't work. Jackson frowned, reconsidering his theory. If the cipher was based on the alphabet, but the sequence was wrong, he wrote quickly. Try reverse order. Luther reset the dial and began again. This time working backward through the sequence: right to 6 left, to 18, right to 8 left, to 2, right to 24 left, to 15. The handle turned smoothly in Luther's grip. The safe door swung open. Inside lay several leather-bound ledgers, a stack of documents tied with ribbon, and a small metal box. Luther gathered everything quickly, stuffing the items into a canvas bag he pulled from his coat. This is it, he said, voice tight with suppressed excitement. Names, dates, transactions. Everything needed to destroy Thorne and his entire operation. Jackson nodded in satisfaction, then gestured toward the door. They had what they came for. It was time to leave. As they turned to exit, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Both men froze, weapons raised toward the door. It opened slowly, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light. For one terrible moment, Jackson thought Thorne had returned unexpectedly. Then the figure stepped into the office and relief flooded through him. It was only Wilson, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight. The women are safely away, Wilson reported, breathing heavily as if he'd been running. But we have a problem. Riders approaching from the east, at least 6 men moving fast. Luther's face drained of color. Thorne, he said. He must have been warned. Jackson wrote quickly. How much time? Minutes, not hours, Wilson replied grimly. We need to leave now. They moved swiftly through the house and back into the compound yard. The diversion at the southern fence had been extinguished, the remaining guards now milling about in confusion. At the sight of Luther emerging from the main house with 2 strangers, they reached for their weapons. Stand down, Luther called with practiced authority. These men are with me. Thorne's orders. The guards hesitated, conditioned to obey Luther's commands, but suspicious of the unfamiliar faces. Sir, one began uncertainly. We should. He never finished the sentence. A rifle shot cracked through the night, and the guard fell, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. More shots followed in rapid succession, coming from the direction of the eastern approach. Take cover, Luther shouted, pushing Jackson and Wilson toward the shelter of the bunkhouse porch. Bullets splintered wood around them as they ran the night suddenly alive with gunfire and shouting. They reached the porch just as riders burst through the main gate, Thorne at their head, his face a mask of cold fury visible even in the dim lamplight. Reeves, he bellowed, spotting Luther. You treacherous dog! Luther returned fire, forcing Thorne and his men to scatter for cover. Get to the east fence, he told Jackson and Wilson. I'll hold them here. Jackson shook his head firmly, raising his own rifle to fire at a rider who had ventured too close. The man tumbled from his saddle with a cry of pain. This isn't a debate, Emerson, Luther snapped. That evidence needs to reach Eleanor. It's the only way to end this permanently. Before Jackson could respond, Wilson made a strangled sound and staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, where a dark stain was rapidly spreading. Go! Luther insisted, firing again to keep Thorne's men pinned down. Get Wilson out of here. I'll be right behind you. Jackson knew a tactical necessity when he saw one. With a quick nod to Luther, he grabbed Wilson's good arm and began half-dragging, half-carrying the wounded doctor toward the east fence. Bullets kicked up dirt at their heels, but Luther's covering fire kept the worst of the danger at bay. They reached the fence breach, Jackson pushing Wilson through first, before turning to provide his own covering fire. Luther was still at the bunkhouse, exchanging shots with Thorne's men, who had taken positions behind water troughs and wagon wheels. Luther, Jackson called hoarsely, his voice rusty from disuse. Now. Whether Luther heard him over the gunfire was impossible to tell. The scarred man glanced in their direction, nodded once, then turned his attention back to the approaching threat. Thorne himself had dismounted and was advancing with cold determination, firing methodically with a revolver that gleamed silver in the lamplight. A bullet struck the fence inches from Jackson's head, sending splinters flying. Wilson, now on the other side, called urgently, Jackson, we have to go. One more moment. Jackson hesitated, watching as Luther began to retreat toward their position, firing as he moved. Then Thorne's bullet found its mark, catching Luther in the leg. He stumbled, went down on one knee, his rifle clattering to the ground. Jackson raised his own weapon, ready to provide covering fire for Luther's final dash to safety. But before he could fire, Luther made a sharp, urgent gesture. Go. Now, in that gesture was the clarity of a man who had accepted his fate. Luther knew he wouldn't make it to the fence. He was buying time with his life. With a bitter taste in his mouth, Jackson slipped through the fence breach, grabbing Wilson's arm to help the wounded doctor into the forest's sheltering darkness. Behind them, gunfire continued, then gradually faded as they put distance between themselves and the compound. They moved as quickly as Wilson's injury allowed, following the path that would lead them to the church in Bandera, where Naomi, Eleanor, and the freed women waited. The evidence was secure in the canvas bag, slung across Jackson's shoulder, Luther's final contribution to their cause. As the sounds of pursuit faded, entirely replaced by the night sounds of the forest, Jackson allowed himself a moment of grief for the man they'd left behind. Luther Reeves had been Eleanor's son in all but blood, a man seeking redemption for past sins. Whether he had found it in his final stand, only God could judge. But Jackson knew with cold certainty that Caleb Thorne would pay for this night's work. The evidence they carried would ensure it. Luther's sacrifice would not be in vain. Beside him, Wilson stumbled, his face pale with blood loss. Jackson adjusted his grip, taking more of the doctor's weight as they continued their journey through the darkness. There would be time for mourning later. For now, they had wounded to 10 women to protect and justice to secure. The war wasn't over yet. The church stood silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, its steeple reaching toward heaven like a supplicant's hand. Lights glowed in the windows, warm and welcoming, after the long trek through darkness. Jackson supported Wilson up the steps, the doctor's breathing labored from pain and exertion. The wooden door opened before they reached it, revealing Naomi's anxious face. "Thank God," she breathed relief, flooding her features as she saw them. The relief vanished instantly when she registered Wilson's blood-soaked coat and Luther's absence. "Inside quickly," she urged, holding the door wider. The church's interior had been transformed into a makeshift hospital and refuge. Pews had been pushed aside to make room for pallets where the freed women rested. Lanterns cast a gentle glow over the scene, illuminating exhausted faces marked by both trauma and tentative hope. Eleanor rushed forward at their entrance, her eyes darting past them in search of her son. "Luther," she asked, voice tight with dread. Jackson couldn't meet her gaze. Instead, he handed her the canvas bag containing the evidence from Thorne's safe. Eleanor understood immediately, her face crumpling with grief. For a moment, she seemed about to collapse. Then, with visible effort, she straightened, clutching the bag to her chest. "He knew the risks," she said softly. "He accepted them willingly." A single tear tracked down her weathered cheek. Was he at the end? Was he brave? Jackson nodded, meeting her eyes now and trying to convey what words couldn't, that her son had died with honor, protecting others, finding the redemption he sought. "Good," Eleanor whispered. "That's good." She took a deep breath, visibly composing herself. "Dr. Wilson needs attention, Naomi." Naomi had already moved to Wilson's side, helping Jackson lower him onto a cleared pew. With practiced efficiency, she cut away the doctor's blood-soaked coat and shirt, revealing a bullet wound in his left shoulder. "Clean through," she announced after careful examination. "Missed the major vessels. And bone." She glanced up at Wilson's pale face. "You're lucky, doctor." "Doesn't feel lucky," Wilson managed through gritted teeth. "It will once the laudanum takes effect." Naomi promised, reaching for her medical bag. "Jackson, I need hot water and clean cloths." Jackson nodded and moved toward the back of the church where a small stove had been set up. As he heated water, he surveyed the room, taking inventory of their situation. 11 women, as Eleanor had said, plus 2 small children. All appeared physically intact, if exhausted and traumatized. Thomas and Samuel stood guard at the windows, rifles ready, their expressions grim but determined. Outside, wagons waited to transport the women north once it was deemed safe to travel. It was a fragile security they had established here, temporary shelter that would become a death trap if Thorne tracked them to Bandera. The town was too small, too exposed. They needed to move the women soon before daylight made travel conspicuous. Jackson returned to Naomi's side with the requested water and cloths. She was administering laudanum to Wilson, her movements gentle but efficient. The doctor's eyes were already glazing as the powerful opiate began to take effect. "Will he be able to travel?" Jackson wrote on his slate. "Not immediately," Naomi replied. "The wound needs cleaning and proper bandaging, and he'll need monitoring for infection." Jackson frowned, considering their options. He wrote, "Thorne will search Bandera first. Not safe here." "I know," Naomi agreed softly, "but we can't move everyone tonight. The women are exhausted and Wilson needs proper care." From across the room, Eleanor joined their conversation. "The women will leave at first light," she said. 3 separate groups, 3 different routes north. Arrangements have been made. "And Wilson?" "He stays with me," Eleanor said firmly. "This church has hidden rooms that served the Underground Railroad during the war. He'll be safe until he's well enough to travel." What about you? Jackson wrote, concern evident in his expression. I've lived in Bandera for 30 years, Jackson. I'm a harmless old widow who tends the church and minds her own business. Eleanor's smile held no humor. Besides, someone needs to deliver this evidence to the federal marshal in Austin. Might as well be the person Thorne would least suspect. Jackson shook his head, writing quickly. Too dangerous. Thorne knows Luther was your son. Adopted son, Eleanor corrected, and few in Bandera knew of our connection. Luther was careful about that. Her expression hardened with resolve. This evidence doesn't just condemn Thorne. It implicates the governor and half the territorial officials. It needs to reach federal authorities, not local ones who might be compromised. She was right, Jackson knew. The corruption Thorne had fostered ran deep its tendrils, reaching into every level of regional authority. Only federal intervention would truly end it. Then I'll take it, he wrote. No, Eleanor countered immediately. You're needed elsewhere. She glanced meaningfully toward Naomi, who was focused on cleaning Wilson's wound. The women trust her, and she trusts you. They'll need protection on their journey north. Before Jackson could respond, the church door opened slightly, admitting Thomas, who had been standing watch outside. Riders, he reported in a low voice, coming fast from the east. 6, maybe 7. Eleanor's face paled, but her voice remained steady. How long? Minutes, Thomas replied grimly. We need to move now. A flurry of activity erupted as the women were roused and directed toward the back door where the wagons waited. Naomi worked quickly to bandage Wilson's shoulder, making it secure enough for potential movement. Jackson retrieved his rifle, checking that it was loaded and ready. On his slate, he wrote a quick message to Eleanor Hyde Wilson. Get the women away. I'll delay them. Eleanor read the message, her eyes widening. That's suicide, Jackson. There are too many. He simply looked at her, his expression conveying what words couldn't, that he had made his decision, that some prices were worth paying, that she should not waste precious seconds arguing. Very well, she conceded, but you're not facing them alone. She turned to Thomas and Samuel. Get the women safely away, then circle back if you can. The men nodded, already moving to escort the frightened women to the waiting wagons. Naomi, having finished with Wilson, approached Jackson, her face set in determined lines. I'm staying too, she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Jackson shook his head firmly, writing, Go with the women. They need you. They have Eleanor and the men, Naomi countered, and I'm not leaving you to face Thorne alone. Before Jackson could argue further, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, followed by shouts as riders entered the town. No more time, Eleanor said urgently. Naomi, help me get Wilson to the hidden room. Jackson, buy us what time you can. With a last lingering look at Naomi, Jackson moved to the front of the church, positioning himself behind a heavy oak pew that offered both concealment and protection. Through the windows, he could see riders entering the town square, Thorne at their head, his face illuminated by the torches his men carried. The scene held a terrible symmetry, Thorne hunting Naomi as he had that first night, Jackson preparing to defend her as he had then. But this time there would be no easy resolution, no simple choice to hide or reveal himself. This time blood would flow. Behind him, he heard the soft scrape of a hidden door closing, followed by footsteps as Naomi returned to the main church. Instead of leaving with Eleanor and Wilson, she took position at another window, a revolver clutched in her steady hands. Jackson wanted to be angry at her disobedience, but found he could only admire her courage. She had every reason to flee Thorne, every justification for self-preservation. Yet here she stood ready to fight alongside him. Outside, Thorne's voice rang out in the pre-dawn stillness. Eleanor Martin, we know you're harboring fugitives. Come out now, and I'll be merciful. No response came from the church. The back door had closed silently behind the last of the fleeing women, the wagons already moving away from town by a secondary road. Very well, Thorne called after a moment. Remember that I offered mercy. Mosh at his signal, riders dismounted and spread out, approaching the church from multiple angles. 2 men carried torches toward the building's wooden walls. Jackson sighted his rifle on the nearest torchbearer and fired. The man dropped with a cry of pain, his torch falling harmlessly to the dirt. The second torchbearer dove for cover, but Naomi's shot found him winging his shoulder and sending him scrambling back toward the horses. Return fire erupted from Thorne's men bullets, splintering the church windows and thudding into the walls. Jackson and Naomi ducked below their respective windowsills, waiting for a pause in the barrage. I know you're in there, Nurse Wallace, Thorne's voice called during a lull in the shooting. Did you think I wouldn't recognize your handiwork in my compound? The way my men were disabled rather than killed. Always the healer, even when playing soldier. Naomi's face tightened at his words, but she remained silent, checking her revolver with steady hands. And you, Emerson, Thorne continued, the silent mountain man. I should have killed you that first night. An oversight I intend to correct. Jackson raised his head cautiously, surveying the positions of Thorne's men. They had taken cover behind water troughs, wagon wheels, in the corner of the general store across the square. Thorne himself stood on the church steps, seemingly unconcerned about presenting such an obvious target. Understanding dawned in Jackson's mind. Thorne wanted them to shoot at him. He was deliberately drawing their fire to reveal their positions while his men flanked the church. Jackson ducked back down and crawled to Naomi's side. On his slate, he wrote, "Trying to flank us. Need to move." She nodded grimly, understanding the tactical situation. Where Jackson pointed upward toward the church belfry. From that elevated position, they could command the square, preventing any approach to the building. It wouldn't save them indefinitely, but it might buy enough time for the women to reach safety. Naomi nodded her agreement, and together they crept toward the staircase that led to the belfry. They had nearly reached it when the front door of the church burst open, kicked in by one of Thorne's men, who charged inside, revolver blazing. Jackson shoved Naomi toward the stairs, turning to face the intruder with his rifle. Two shots rang out almost simultaneously, Jackson's striking the man in the chest, the man's going wide and splintering the wooden railing of the staircase. "Go," Jackson urged hoarsely, his voice barely audible after so long disused. He reloaded quickly, covering the door as Naomi ascended the stairs. Outside, Thorne bellowed orders to his remaining men. "Burn it! Burn the whole damn church!" Jackson followed Naomi up the narrow stairs, emerging into the small belfry just as flames began to lick at the church's eastern wall. From this vantage point, they could see Thorne's men spreading out torches in hand, circling the building with clear intent. Naomi fired at one, her shot going wide but forcing the man to retreat. Jackson's aim proved more accurate, dropping another torchbearer with a clean shot to the leg. But there were too many. For every man they drove back, another approached from a different angle. Soon flames were climbing the exterior wall, smoke beginning to seep into the church below. "We're trapped," Naomi said softly, the reality of their situation becoming clear. Jackson nodded grimly, continuing to fire at any target that presented itself. They had perhaps minutes before the fire reached the belfry, before smoke made their position untenable. In the square below, Thorne watched the burning church with cold satisfaction, certain of his victory. The women might have escaped, but two of his most troublesome enemies would not survive the night. As smoke thickened around them, Jackson turned to Naomi. In her face, he saw not fear, but a calm acceptance that mirrored his own. They had known the risks. They had chosen this path willingly, understanding what it might cost. Naomi reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "At least we freed them," she said softly. "At least we did that much." Jackson nodded, squeezing her hand gently. If these were to be their final moments, he would spend them connected to this remarkable woman who had brought purpose back into his life. The smoke grew denser, making breathing difficult. Jackson tore a strip from his shirt, dampening it with water from his canteen and pressing it to Naomi's face to filter the worst of the smoke. She did the same for him, their movements synchronized without need for words. Below, the church's interior was now fully engulfed, flames climbing toward the belfry with hungry determination. The heat became intense, sweat streaming down their faces as they huddled together against the inevitable. "I wish we'd had more time," Naomi whispered, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the fire. Jackson pulled her closer, pressing his forehead to hers in silent agreement. So much left unsaid. So many possibilities unexplored. The floor beneath them groaned ominously, weakened by the consuming flames. Soon it would give way entirely, sending them plunging into the inferno below. And then, cutting through the crackling of flames and the creaking of burning timber, came a new sound: hoofbeats. Many hoofbeats approaching fast from the west. Jackson and Naomi looked at each other in confusion, then toward the source of the sound. In the growing light of dawn, riders appeared at the edge of town, not 6 or 7, but dozens. At their head rode a man in the distinctive uniform of a federal marshal badge gleaming on his chest. In the square, Thorne's men scattered at the sight of this unexpected force, abandoning their torches and fleeing for their horses. Only Thorne himself stood his ground, face contorted with rage, as he realized his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. The marshal's men surrounded the burning church, some dismounting to begin fighting the fire with buckets from the nearby well, others pursuing Thorne's fleeing men. "Here," Naomi called, waving frantically from the belfry window. "We're up here." Two riders approached with a wagon, positioning it beneath the belfry. "Jump," one called. "The floor won't hold much longer." Jackson glanced down, measuring the distance 20 feet at least, onto a wagon bed covered with what appeared to be sacks of feed. Dangerous, but preferable to burning. He looked at Naomi, raising an eyebrow in question. "Together," she said firmly, tightening her grip on his hand. With a synchronized movement born of newfound trust, they climbed onto the belfry ledge and leapt into the empty air, still hand in hand as gravity claimed them. They hit the wagon bed hard, the impact driving the breath from their lungs, but the sacks absorbing the worst of the force. Pain lanced through Jackson's leg as it twisted beneath him, but he was alive. Beside him, Naomi gasped for breath, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes bright with the miracle of survival. Men pulled them from the wagon, supporting them as they limped away from the burning church. Behind them, the belfry collapsed with a tremendous crash, sending sparks spiraling into the dawn sky like ascending prayers. The marshal approached, his weathered face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Jackson Emerson," he inquired, looking between them. Jackson nodded once, still struggling to catch his breath. "Eleanor Martin reached us on the road to Austin," the marshal explained. "Brought evidence of corruption that goes higher than I've seen in 30 years of service." He glanced at the burning church, then back to them. "Seems we arrived just in time." "Thorne," Naomi asked, her voice hoarse from smoke. The marshal's expression hardened. "Won't be troubling anyone ever again. Decided to resist arrest." He didn't elaborate, but the meaning was clear. Caleb Thorne had met the justice he'd evaded for so long. Relief washed over Naomi's face, followed quickly by concern. "The women, did they get away safely?" "My men intercepted the wagons on the North Road," the marshal confirmed. "They're under protection now, including the good doctor and Ms. Martin." Jackson sagged slightly in relief, the weight of responsibility lifting from his shoulders. They had succeeded. Against all odds, they had succeeded. As medical attention was summoned for their injuries, Jackson found himself unable to release Naomi's hand, unwilling to break the connection that had sustained them through smoke and flame. She made no effort to pull away, her fingers remaining firmly intertwined with his. Around them, the town of Bandera was awakening citizens, emerging from their homes to stare in shock at the burning church, the federal marshals, and the two smoke-blackened figures at the center of it all. "What happens now?" Naomi asked softly, the question directed not at the marshal, but at Jackson. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing beyond the soot and exhaustion to the strength and compassion that defined her. In her eyes, he saw not just the past they had shared, but the future they might build. For the first time in years, Jackson Emerson found words worth speaking. "We heal," he said simply, his voice rough from smoke and disuse, but clear in its certainty. "Together." And as the sun rose fully over the Texas hill, country painting the limestone cliffs in shades of gold, and promised Naomi's smile told him that was answer enough. Sunrise painted the eastern sky in bands of gold and crimson, a beautiful counterpoint to the destruction that smoldered in Bandera's town square. The church, once a sanctuary, then a battlefield, now stood as a blackened skeleton, wisps of smoke still rising from its charred remains, like departing spirits. Jackson sat on the edge of a wagon bed, allowing a young medical assistant to bandage his twisted ankle. The pain was minimal compared to injuries he'd sustained during the war, but he submitted to the treatment without protest, his attention focused on Naomi across the square. She stood with a federal marshal gesturing as she spoke, her face animated, despite the exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. Even soot-streaked and disheveled, she commanded respect, her natural authority drawing others to listen. The marshal nodded frequently, occasionally making notes in a small book. Jackson had spoken only those two words since their rescue, "We heal," before retreating back into the silence that had become his natural state. Yet something had shifted inside him, as if a door long closed had been forced ajar, allowing light to penetrate the darkness. The medical assistant finished his work, patting Jackson's bandaged ankle with professional satisfaction. "Should heal clean if you stay off it for a few days," he advised. "Though something tells me you are not one to idle." Jackson offered a small nod of thanks, then tested his weight on the injured limb. Pain flared, but it was manageable. He'd walked on worse. Across the square, Naomi concluded her conversation with the marshal and made her way toward Jackson, her limp more pronounced than usual. Smoke inhalation had left her voice raspy, giving her words a husky quality when she spoke. "Marshal Davis has men escorting the women to a safe house near Austin," she reported, settling beside Jackson on the wagon bed. "From there, they'll be given new identities and transportation to wherever they choose to go." Jackson nodded, retrieving his slate and the evidence. "Being taken directly to federal authorities in Washington," Naomi said. "Davis doesn't trust anyone closer given how high the corruption reaches." She sighed, rubbing a hand across her face, leaving a fresh smudge of soot on her cheek. "It's over, Jackson. Thorne is dead. His operation is dismantled. The women are free." He studied her face, noting the complex emotions that played across her features. Relief, certainly, but also a hollow emptiness that often followed intense purpose once fulfilled. He wrote carefully, "Yet you don't seem at peace." Naomi gave a tired smile. Perceptive as always, she stared at the smoldering ruins of the church. "I should feel triumphant. Instead, I just feel empty, as if I've been running so long that I've forgotten how to stand still." Jackson understood completely. After the war, he had experienced that same disorienting absence of purpose, that same vertigo, when the driving force of survival and mission suddenly vanished. What happens now, he wrote, echoing her question from earlier. Naomi shook her head slightly. I don't know. For so long, my only goal was escape, then justice. I never thought beyond that. She glanced at him. What about you? Will you return to your cabin? The question gave him pause. The solitary existence he had built for himself suddenly seemed hollow, a half-life rather than a full one. Yet the alternative, rejoining a world that had lost meaning for him, was equally daunting. Before he could respond, a commotion at the edge of town drew their attention. A wagon approached, driven by Dr. Wilson, whose injured arm was supported by a sling. Beside him sat Eleanor, her face drawn with grief, but her posture straight and dignified. Eleanor, Naomi breathed, rising quickly despite her injuries. She came back. Jackson followed more slowly, testing his weight on his injured ankle as he limped toward the arriving wagon. Eleanor's eyes found his, immediately communicating a complex mixture of sorrow and gratitude that needed no words. Luther, she asked simply as Jackson reached the wagon. He shook his head once, confirming what she already knew, that her son had not survived Thorne's retribution. Eleanor nodded, absorbing the final confirmation of her loss with remarkable composure. He died as he would have wanted, she said softly, making amends. Wilson reached across to pat her hand gently, his physician's face reflecting professional concern. You should be resting, Eleanor. The journey was difficult enough. There will be time for rest later, she replied firmly. First, there are arrangements to be made. She looked between Naomi and Jackson. For all of us. Marshal Davis approached, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. Mrs. Martin, Dr. Wilson, glad to see you both safe. Thank you, Marshal, Eleanor acknowledged. I understand from your men that Thorne's evidence is secure. Yes, ma'am, being transported under heavy guard. Davis glanced at the burned church, regret evident in his weathered features. I'm sorry we didn't arrive in time to save your church. Buildings can be rebuilt, Eleanor said simply. Lives cannot. She looked pointedly at Naomi and Jackson. Though I understand these two nearly joined the casualties. Naomi smiled faintly. It was a near thing. Eleanor's expression softened as she studied them both. Too near, which brings me to why I returned. She straightened, addressing all those gathered. None of you are safe here, not yet. Thorne's operation extended far beyond himself. There are powerful people implicated in that evidence who would still prefer it and any witnesses to disappear. The marshal nodded grimly. Mrs. Martin is right. Until the federal investigation is complete, everyone involved in exposing Thorne's operation remains at risk. What do you suggest? Naomi asked. Temporary relocation, Eleanor replied. Somewhere remote, somewhere unexpected. She looked directly at Jackson. Somewhere like your cabin in the hills. Jackson blinked in surprise, then wrote quickly, Not large enough for everyone. But everyone, Eleanor clarified. The women are already being scattered to various safe locations. I speak of just the four of us, you, Naomi, myself, and Dr. Wilson, while he recovers. Jackson considered this, then nodded slowly. His cabin was remote enough to provide safety, yet close enough to Bandera that Eleanor could return to oversee the church's rebuilding once the danger passed. It's settled then, Eleanor said with the quiet authority that had guided countless escaped slaves and now freed women to safety. We leave within the hour before word of Thorne's death spreads and his allies begin searching for survivors. As preparations were made for their departure, Jackson found himself watching Naomi, who had moved to help Wilson secure medical supplies for their journey. Something like anticipation stirred in his chest, not the dread of impending battle that had become so familiar, but a lighter, more hopeful sensation. For the first time in years, he was not returning to his solitude alone. The journey to Jackson's cabin took most of the day, their progress slowed by the need to avoid main roads and the caution required for Wilson's and Jackson's injuries. They traveled in a small wagon provided by the marshal, Eleanor driving, while Wilson dozed fitfully, the laudanum prescribed for his wound, rendering him semi-conscious. Naomi sat in the wagon bed, rifle across her knees as she watched the terrain behind them for any sign of pursuit. Jackson rode alongside on a horse borrowed from one of the marshal's men, scouting the path ahead despite the pain in his ankle. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts. The events in Bandera had left them physically and emotionally drained, the aftermath of violence and tension settling into their bones like a deep chill. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the familiar outlines of Jackson's clearing came into view. The cabin stood unchanged, a testament to the constancy of some things amid chaos. The sight brought an unexpected tightness to Jackson's throat, not homesickness exactly, but a recognition of sanctuary. He guided the wagon to the cabin door, dismounting carefully to avoid jarring his injured ankle. Inside, everything remained as they had left it, simple, orderly, undisturbed. The fire had died to cold ash in the hearth, but otherwise it seemed they might have departed only hours ago rather than days. "It's lovely," Eleanor commented as she entered, her appreciative gaze taking in the neat bookshelves, the dried herbs hanging from rafters, the maps covering one wall. "You've created quite a haven here, Jackson." He nodded in acknowledgement, moving to rekindle the fire while Naomi and Eleanor helped Wilson to the cabin's single cot. The doctor was pale, his wound seeping slightly through the bandages, but his breathing remained steady. "He needs rest and careful monitoring," Naomi observed, checking Wilson's pulse with practiced fingers. "The journey was hard on him." Eleanor nodded agreement. "I'll sit with him first. You both look ready to collapse yourselves." Indeed, now that they had reached safety, the adrenaline that had sustained Jackson was ebbing rapidly, leaving bone-deep weariness in its wake. Naomi appeared equally exhausted, dark circles shadowing her eyes like bruises against her pale skin. Jackson gestured toward a chest in the corner, then wrote on his slate, "Extra blankets. You can rest by the fire." "What about you?" Naomi asked, concern evident despite her fatigue. "I'll keep watch outside. Make sure we weren't followed." Though he doubted any pursuit would find them so quickly, the habit of vigilance was too ingrained to abandon completely. Besides, the small cabin felt suddenly crowded after years of solitude. He needed space to adjust to the presence of others in his sanctuary. As dusk settled over the hills, Jackson positioned himself on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, rifle across his knees, senses attuned to the forest around him. The evening air carried the scent of pine and distant rain, clean and restorative after the smoke and blood of Bandera. He hadn't intended to sleep, but exhaustion claimed him nonetheless. His chin dropped to his chest, his breathing deepened, and the world receded into blessed darkness. Jackson woke with a start, disoriented by the silver wash of moonlight that had replaced the golden hues of sunset. A blanket had been draped over his shoulders, someone had found him sleeping, and covered him rather than waking him. Naomi sat beside him on the log, her profile etched in moonlight as she gazed into the forest. She had washed the soot from her face and changed into clean clothing. One of his shirts, he noted the sleeves rolled up to accommodate her smaller frame. Sensing his wakefulness, she turned, offering a small smile. "I thought I'd relieve you," she said softly. "You've been asleep for hours." Jackson straightened, embarrassed to have been caught neglecting his self-appointed duty. He reached for his slate, only to realize he had left it in the cabin. Naomi seemed to understand his predicament. "Eleanor and Wilson are both sleeping," she reported. "No sign of anyone following us." He nodded, grateful for the information. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the soft sigh of wind through pine needles. "It's so peaceful here," Naomi observed. "I can see why you chose it." Jackson studied her profile, noting the relaxation that had softened her features. The constant vigilance that had marked her since their first meeting had eased, and allowing glimpses of the woman she might have been without Thorne's cruelty. "When I first escaped," she continued, "I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe again. Every shadow held a threat. Every stranger was an enemy." She turned to look at him directly. "But here with you, I've remembered what safety feels like." The simple admission stirred something in Jackson's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the blanket around his shoulders. He wanted to respond, to tell her that her presence had changed something in him as well, but without his slate, he had only gestures and expressions. Or words. He could use words as he had in that moment of crisis at the church. The thought both tempted and terrified him. Before he could decide, Naomi spoke again. "You don't have to say anything," she assured him, correctly interpreting his internal struggle. "I just wanted you to know that what you've given me, this sanctuary, this protection, it means more than I can express." Jackson reached for her hand, his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller ones in a gentle grip. In that simple contact was everything he couldn't yet voice: understanding, gratitude, and something deeper that neither was quite ready to name. They sat together as the moon continued its arc across the sky. Hands joined silence, speaking what words could not. Days passed in the remote cabin, a strange domestic rhythm establishing itself among the four unlikely housemates. Eleanor took charge of cooking, transforming Jackson's simple provisions into surprisingly flavorful meals. Wilson, as his strength returned, spent hours cataloging the medicinal herbs Jackson had collected, adding physician's notes to the trapper's practical knowledge. Naomi divided her time between assisting with Wilson's recovery and accompanying Jackson on short excursions to check snares or gather firewood. Her limp improved daily, as did Jackson's ankle, allowing them to venture farther from the cabin as the week progressed. They had received one brief visit from a federal marshal, not Davis, but a younger man who brought news from Austin. The evidence from Thorne's safe had begun yielding results. Arrests had been made, including 2 territorial judges and a deputy governor. The women rescued from the compound had been safely relocated, some as far north as Chicago and St. Louis. In the brands, Naomi had asked, her hand unconsciously moving to her thigh. Is there any way to remove them? The marshal had shaken his head regretfully. Not completely, ma'am, but Dr. Wilson may know of treatments to reduce their appearance. The news had cast a temporary shadow over Naomi's spirits. That evening, Jackson found her at the creek, staring into the water with a troubled expression. It will always be there, she said without looking up as he approached. A permanent reminder of what he did, what I was to him. Jackson settled beside her on the creek bank, retrieving his slate from his pocket. A scar is just a mark of survival, nothing more. Naomi sighed. Easy to say when it's not visible to every doctor, every potential husband, She broke off, color rising in her cheeks. Jackson wrote carefully, anyone who sees the brand, but not the woman who survived it, is not worth your concern. She looked at him, then really looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of platitude or false comfort. Finding none, she smiled slightly. You truly believe that, don't you? He nodded once, definitive, then wrote, we all carry scars, Naomi, some visible, some not. Like your silence, she asked softly. Jackson hesitated, then nodded again. His inability or unwillingness to speak was indeed a scar, a mark left by war and loss and grief. Yet you spoke at the church, Naomi observed, when it mattered most. He had. 2 words forced past years of silence when the moment demanded it. The memory still surprised him, not just that he had spoken, but that his voice had remained his own, recognizable, despite its long disuse. Exceptional circumstances, he wrote. Perhaps, Naomi agreed, though her expression suggested she believed otherwise. Or perhaps you're healing too in your own way. The observation hit closer to truth than Jackson was entirely comfortable acknowledging. Since Naomi's arrival, something had been changing within him, a slow thawing of frozen parts, a gradual reconnection with emotions he had thought permanently severed. Before he could respond, a sound from the direction of the cabin caught their attention, Eleanor's voice calling their names with unusual urgency. They found her at the clearing's edge, her face pale with distress. Wilson's fever has spiked, she reported. The wound is infected. Naomi immediately shifted into her nurse's role, all personal concerns forgotten as she hurried to the cabin. Jackson followed, a sense of dread building in his chest. Infection was a familiar enemy from the war. Insidious patient, often more deadly than bullets. Inside, Wilson lay on the cot, his face flushed with fever, breath coming in short-labored gasps. When Naomi removed the bandage from his shoulder, the reason for his deterioration became immediately apparent. The wound had turned angry red, the flesh around it swollen and hot to the touch. Red streaks extended outward from the bullet hole, blood poisoning, advancing rapidly. How long has he been like this? Naomi asked, her voice calm, despite the seriousness of the situation. The fever began this morning, but I thought it was just a reaction to the journey. Eleanor replied, distress evident in her normally composed features. It's worsened dramatically in the last hour. Naomi nodded, her mind already calculating treatments and probabilities. We need willow bark for the fever and a poultice to draw out the infection. She glanced at Jackson. Do you have yarrow, echinacea, garlic? He nodded, moving immediately to the shelves where he kept his medicinal herbs. And whiskey, Naomi added. The wound needs cleaning again thoroughly. Jackson produced a bottle from a cabinet, its contents reserved for just such medical emergencies. Together they worked to treat Wilson's wound, Naomi directing Jackson and Eleanor following her instructions with quiet efficiency. The bullet had been removed cleanly in Bandera, but something had been missed, a small fragment of cloth carried into the wound perhaps, or a splinter from the church pew where Wilson had taken cover. Whatever the cause, infection had established itself deep in the shoulder. Hours passed as they battled to reduce Wilson's fever and clean the wound. Outside, day faded to evening, then to full night, the changing light visible through the cabin's small windows. Still they worked, taking turns applying cool cloths to Wilson's forehead, administering willow bark tea when he was conscious enough to swallow, changing the poultice when it had drawn what poison it could from the wound. Midnight came and went. Eleanor, exhausted, finally succumbed to sleep in a chair by the fire. Jackson insisted that Naomi rest as well, offering to watch over Wilson for a few hours. Wake me if there's any change, she instructed, reluctantly settling onto a pallet of blankets near the cot. Any change at all, Jackson? He nodded, taking her place beside Wilson. The doctor's condition had stabilized somewhat, his breathing less labored, his fever slightly reduced, but he remained unconscious, occasionally muttering delirious fragments that made little sense. In the quiet darkness, with only the low fire's glow for illumination, Jackson found himself studying Wilson's face. The doctor had risked everything to help free women he barely knew, had been wounded in the process, and now fought for his life in this remote cabin. Why, what drove such selflessness? As if sensing Jackson's scrutiny, Wilson's eyes fluttered open, surprisingly lucid despite the fever. Water, he rasped. Jackson helped him drink from a cup supporting his head with a gentle hand. Thank you, Wilson managed after a few sips, his gaze focused on Jackson with unexpected clarity. Eleanor told me about your brother, Isaiah. Jackson stiffened, slightly surprised by the mention of a name he had shared with few people. I was at Galveston too, Wilson continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Not as a doctor, as a chaplain. This was unexpected. Wilson had never mentioned a religious vocation had presented himself solely as a physician. I left the ministry after the war, Wilson explained as if reading Jackson's thoughts. Couldn't reconcile what I'd seen with what I'd been taught. He closed his eyes briefly, pain crossing his features that had nothing to do with his physical wound. Found medicine more immediately useful than prayer. Jackson nodded, understanding completely. Many men had lost faith during those bloody years. Some had found different paths, as Wilson had. Others, like Jackson himself, had simply retreated from the world entirely. I remember your brother, Wilson said, opening his eyes again. Brave man, saved 3 others before he was hit. He paused, gathering strength to continue. Asked me to pray with him at the end, not for himself, for you. Something tightened in Jackson's chest, a constriction that was part pain, part unexpected warmth. Isaiah, thinking of him even in death. It aligned with everything he knew of his brother's character, yet hearing it confirmed by someone who had been present in those final moments was both painful and precious. He believed you'd find your way home. Wilson continued, his voice growing weaker. Said you were the strongest person he knew. Just needed to find your voice again. Jackson swallowed hard against the emotion rising in his throat. After 2 years of self-imposed exile, was this what finding his way home looked like? Not a physical return to his birthplace, but a reconnection with humanity through Naomi. Eleanor, Wilson himself, think he'd be proud, Wilson murmured, his eyes drifting closed again as exhaustion claimed him. Of who you've become. As the doctor slipped back into sleep, his breathing steadier, now Jackson remained motionless beside the cot, Wilson's words echoing in his mind. Who you've become. Not who he had been before the war, not the soldier he had been during it, but this new iteration, the silent guardian, the reluctant hero, the man who had found purpose in protecting others when he could no longer protect himself. Across the cabin, Naomi stirred in her sleep, one hand reaching out as if seeking something or someone beside her. The gesture, unconscious and vulnerable, tugged at something deep in Jackson's chest. He had told her they would heal together. Perhaps this was what healing looked like, not a return to what had been before, but growth into something new, something previously unimagined. For the first time since Isaiah's death, Jackson allowed himself to consider that possibility. Dawn arrived with gentle insistence, sunlight filtering through the cabin's small windows to touch sleeping faces with golden fingers. Jackson, who had maintained his vigil through the night, watched as the others gradually stirred. First Eleanor, who immediately moved to check on Wilson, then Naomi, who woke with the alert suddenness of someone accustomed to danger. How is he? She asked, crossing to the cot before fully awake. Better, Eleanor reported with cautious optimism. His fever broke around 3. He's sleeping naturally now. Relief softened Naomi's features as she verified Eleanor's assessment with her own examination. The infection is receding, she confirmed. He's not out of danger yet, but if we continue the treatment... She looked up at Jackson, a genuine smile brightening her tired face. You stayed up all night. He nodded, exhaustion suddenly hitting him now that the immediate crisis had passed. Naomi noticed immediately. Your turn to rest, she said firmly. I'll take over. Too weary to argue, Jackson moved to his bedroll near the fireplace, stretching out with a grateful sigh. The last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Naomi's face, watching him with an expression he was too tired to interpret, but which warmed him nonetheless. He slept deeply, dreamlessly, waking only when the quality of light through the windows suggested late afternoon. The cabin was quiet, the cot where Wilson had lain now empty. Jackson sat up quickly, alarm dispelling the last vestiges of sleep. Had Wilson's condition worsened? Had he... The cabin door opened, admitting Eleanor with an armful of wildflowers. Seeing Jackson awake, she smiled reassuringly. Don't worry, the doctor's condition has improved enough that Naomi helped him outside for some fresh air. There by the creek. Relief flooded through Jackson, followed by a wave of something close to embarrassment. He had allowed himself to sleep far longer than intended, neglecting his responsibilities as host and protector. Eleanor seemed to read his thoughts. You needed the rest, she said simply. We all did. It's been a difficult week. An understatement, but a characteristic one from this stoic woman who had endured so much, yet complained so little. Jackson watched as she arranged the wildflowers in a crude pottery mug, transforming the simple vessel into something beautiful. Naomi tells me you have offered to let us stay until it's safe to return to Bandera. Eleanor set her back to him as she fussed with the arrangement. That's very generous considering how long you have lived alone. Jackson reached for his slate writing. You're welcome as long as needed. Eleanor turned, studying his response with thoughtful eyes. Thank you, though I suspect Wilson and I will return sooner than Naomi might. Jackson raised an eyebrow in question. She's found something here, Eleanor explained. A piece I haven't seen in her since before Thorn. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. And perhaps you've found something as well. The question hung in the air between them, gentle but direct. Jackson considered how to respond, finally writing a purpose maybe, beyond survival. That's no small thing, Eleanor observed. Many never find that much. She returned to her flowers, adding, I've buried 2 husbands and now a son, Jackson. Along the way, I've learned that life rarely offers second chances. When it does, wisdom lies in recognizing them. Before Jackson could respond to this subtle but unmistakable advice, the cabin door opened again. Wilson entered, leaning heavily on Naomi's arm, but upright and alert, his color significantly improved from the previous night. Our patient insisted on joining us, Naomi explained, helping Wilson to a chair by the fire, though he promised to rest immediately after dinner. A promise I fully intend to keep, Wilson added with a weak smile, though I maintain that fresh air is the best medicine. Along with proper wound care, adequate hydration, and someone stubborn enough to force willowbark tea down your throat every few hours, Naomi countered good-naturedly. The easy banter, the simple domesticity of the scene, Eleanor arranging flowers. Wilson seated by the fire, Naomi beginning preparations for an evening meal, struck Jackson with unexpected force. His cabin, for so long a place of solitude and silence, had been transformed into something he had never thought to experience again, a home. The realization both comforted and unsettled him. Comfort because the companionship these 3 offered was a balm to a loneliness he had not fully acknowledged. Unsettlement because their presence was temporary, a pause in the journey, not its conclusion. When the immediate danger passed, Eleanor and Wilson would return to Bandera. And Naomi? What would Naomi choose, a new life somewhere else far from the memories of captivity, or? Jackson pushed the thought aside. Better to focus on the present moment. Wilson's recovery, their collective safety, the simple shared meal that Naomi was preparing. The future would arrive soon enough with all its uncertainties and decisions. For now, this unexpected family was whole and healing beneath his roof. It was enough. A week passed, then 2, the days settling into a rhythm that became increasingly comfortable. Wilson's condition improved steadily under Naomi's care, his strength returning enough that he could take short walks around the clearing, cataloging plants and discussing their properties with Jackson. Eleanor spent much of her time reading Jackson's books, occasionally sharing passages aloud in the evenings as they sat around the fire. Her grief for Luther remained evident in quiet moments, but she channeled her sorrow into practical plans for rebuilding the church and expanding its role as a refuge for those in need. Naomi continued to assist Jackson with daily tasks, checking snares, gathering firewood, tending the small garden plot behind the cabin. Their wordless communication had evolved to the point where they could work together for hours with minimal use of the slate, understanding each other through gesture, expression, and shared purpose. In the evenings, Jackson often found her at the creek, seated on the flat rock that had become her preferred spot for contemplation. Sometimes he joined her, sometimes he left her to her solitude, respecting her need for quiet reflection as she respected his. It was during one such evening as spring gave way to early summer that their careful equilibrium shifted. Jackson approached the creek, intending to check his fishing lines, and found Naomi in her usual place. She had bathed recently, her damp hair hanging loose around her shoulders, catching the last golden light of the setting sun. She turned at his approach, offering a small smile that faltered when she saw his expression. "What is it? What's wrong?" He held out a folded paper, a message delivered earlier by a federal marshal who had passed through on his way to Austin. Naomi took it with visible trepidation. "From Marshal Davis," she read aloud. "The federal investigation has concluded its initial phase. Key conspirators have been arrested or fled. It is now safe for witnesses to return to their previous lives if they choose." She looked up from the paper. "We can go back." Jackson nodded, once his face carefully neutral, despite the sudden hollow feeling in his chest. "Eleanor will be pleased." Naomi continued, her own expression difficult to read. "She's been concerned about the church rebuilding." Another nod followed by writing on the slate. Wilson can resume his practice. "Yes," Naomi agreed softly. "Everyone can return to their lives." Everyone except her, Jackson thought, but didn't write. Naomi had no practice to resume, no home to return to. Her life before Thorn had been erased as thoroughly as footprints in a rushing stream. "What will you do?" He finally wrote the question that had haunted him since their first days together. Naomi stared at the creek, watching the water flow over smooth stones with hypnotic consistency. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been thinking about it these past weeks. I could return to nursing, perhaps, find a small town that needs medical care." She paused, then added quietly, "Or I could stay." The last three words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound in their implications. Jackson felt something clench in his chest, hope, fear, anticipation, all tangled together in a knot too complex to unravel. Here he wrote, needing clarification despite the obvious meaning. Naomi met his gaze directly. "Yes, Jackson. Here. With you." Color rose in her cheeks, but she continued steadily. "If that's something you would want." Want. Such a small word for such an enormous concept. What did he want? After years of existing rather than living, of surviving rather than thriving, the question itself felt foreign, but the answer, he realized with sudden clarity, was not. "Yes," he wrote simply. Then after a moment's consideration added, "I would want that very much." Naomi's smile bloomed slowly, transforming her face with a joy he had glimpsed only in fragments before. "Good," she said softly, "because I found something here I never expected to find again. Peace. Purpose." She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his. "A future worth building." Jackson set aside the slate, no longer needing written words to communicate what could be expressed more directly. He drew her gently to her feet, one hand rising to brush a strand of damp hair from her face with tender reverence. The question in his eyes was clear, as was the permission in hers. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, the hesitant exploration of two people who had known too much harshness to rush toward intimacy. His beard was soft against her skin, her lips warm against his. When they parted, Naomi's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if savoring the sensation. "I never thought I'd want to be touched again," she whispered. "After Thorn, after what happened in there, I thought that part of me was dead." Jackson's hand found hers, squeezing gently and understanding. He knew something of that death, that emotional cauterization that followed trauma. He had experienced it himself after the war, had believed certain parts of his humanity permanently extinguished. Yet here they stood, two broken people, finding wholeness in each other's company. Not despite their scars, but because of them, because those marks of survival had shaped them into people capable of recognizing and honoring each other's strength. As the sun slipped behind the western hills, painting the creek with ribbons of amber and rose, Emerson did something he had not done in more than 2 years. He spoke, his voice rough from disuse, but clear in its sincerity. "Dan," he said simply, "stay with me." Naomi's eyes widened at the sound of his voice, then softened with understanding of what the gesture cost and meant. "I will," she promised, her hand tightening around his. "I will, Diego." The church in Bandera rose again from its ashes, its new frame gleaming pale against the Texas sky. Townspeople gathered to raise the steeple, men on ropes and ladders, working with coordinated precision, while women provided food and encouragement from below. Eleanor directed the operation with quiet authority, her practical knowledge of construction surprising those who had known her only as the church caretaker. At her side stood Dr. Wilson, now fully recovered from his wound, occasionally suggesting modifications to ensure the building would serve as both sanctuary and hospital when needed. Jackson and Naomi arrived as the steeple was being secured, their wagon loaded with supplies from his cabin, herbs, medicines, books on healing that would form the core of a new community resource. "Right on time," Eleanor called, crossing to greet them with genuine pleasure. "We're nearly finished for the day." The 4 months since their return to Bandera had transformed both the town and its inhabitants. Federal intervention had removed the corrupt officials who had protected Thorn's operation, replacing them with men and women committed to justice and rebuilding. The church, once merely a place of worship, was being redesigned as a community center that would provide medical care, education, and refuge for those in need. Wilson had resumed his practice, now openly combining traditional medicine with the herbal knowledge he had gained during his convalescence at Jackson's cabin. Eleanor had emerged as a community leader, her years of quiet resistance now recognized and respected by townspeople who had previously overlooked her. And Jackson and Naomi had created something entirely new, a healing practice that bridged conventional medicine and traditional knowledge, serving those in the remote hill country who had previously gone without care. They traveled regularly between Jackson's cabin, which remained their home, and Bandera, where they assisted Wilson and contributed to the church's new mission. "How goes the cataloging?" Wilson asked as they unloaded the wagon, referring to their ongoing project of documenting medicinal plants of the region. "Nearly complete," Naomi replied, patting a leather-bound journal filled with Jackson's precise handwriting and her own detailed illustrations. We've identified 14 plants with antiseptic properties, 9 with fever-reducing effects, and numerous others with specific applications. Remarkable, Wilson said with genuine admiration. When published, it will transform medical practice in rural areas. If published, Naomi corrected, glancing at Jackson with a small smile. My partner remains somewhat reluctant about public recognition. Jackson's reticence was understandable. Though he now spoke when necessary primarily with Naomi, occasionally with Eleanor and Wilson, he remained a private man who preferred the quiet of the hills to the bustle of even a small town like Bandera. Speaking of partners, Eleanor interjected, her observant eyes noting the silver band on Naomi's left hand. I see congratulations are in order. Naomi's smile widened as she glanced at the simple ring crafted by Jackson from a silver coin, a more permanent replacement for the brass one he had initially given her. 2 days ago, she confirmed, a private ceremony, just the two of us. She reached for Jackson's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become natural over the months. Though we'd welcome a blessing from you, Eleanor, when the church is complete. It would be my honor, Eleanor said warmly, and perhaps the first official function of the new building. As the conversation continued, Jackson found himself studying the scene around them, the rising church, the bustling townspeople, the 3 people who had become his unlikely family. So much had changed in the months since Naomi had washed up on the creek bank like a half-drowned sparrow. He had changed perhaps most of all. The silent hermit who had pulled her from the water now spoke when words were needed, engaged with the world when engagement served a purpose, and had discovered in himself a capacity for healing that extended beyond herbs and poultices to the deeper wounds of the spirit. Naomi caught his thoughtful expression and squeezed his hand gently. All right, she asked softly. He nodded, returning the pressure of her fingers. More than all right. For the first time since the war, perhaps for the first time in his life, Jackson Emerson felt complete. Not despite his scars, but because of what they had taught him, not in spite of his past, but because it had led him, however circuitously, to this moment. As the day waned and they prepared to return to their cabin in the hills, Naomi paused beside the wagon, her face turned toward the setting sun. The light caught the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, laugh lines newer than the worry lines that had been there when they met. Sometimes I still can't believe it, she said quietly. How much has changed, who we've become. Jackson understood completely. Their journey from that first desperate night to this peaceful evening seemed almost mythic in its transformation from branding to belonging, from silence to speech, from survival to living. Isaiah was right, he said, his voice still raspy from long disuse but growing stronger with practice. Naomi looked at him questioningly. About finding my way home, Jackson explained. He gazed at her, this woman who had arrived broken and desperate yet had helped heal his deepest wounds even as he tended hers. Not a place, a purpose. People. Home, Naomi repeated softly, testing the word as if it were new to her vocabulary. Yes, I suppose that's what we found, isn't it? Not just shelter, but home. As they drove away from Bandera, the setting sun painting the limestone cliffs in shades of gold and amber, Jackson reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the creek where he had found her to the burning church where they had nearly died, to this moment of quiet contentment, a path marked by violence and loss, but ultimately leading to redemption. The brand on Naomi's thigh would never completely fade. The memories of what she had endured would never entirely vanish. But like all scars, they had become marks of survival, rather than symbols of ownership, testament to a strength that had enabled her not just to endure, but to rebuild. In Jackson's own scars, the nightmares that still occasionally haunted his sleep, the grief for Isaiah that would never fully disappear, the memories of war that had stolen his voice, these two had transformed from wounds into wisdom. Together they had crafted something neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed, a shared life built on mutual understanding, a partnership founded on reciprocal healing, a love that acknowledged brokenness, yet celebrated wholeness. As their wagon crested the hill that would lead them home to the cabin, nestled among the oaks, Jackson reached for Naomi's hand. She took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of those who had chosen each other deliberately, with full knowledge of both darkness and light. The road ahead stretched before them, winding through hills that had witnessed their separate suffering and shared healing. Whatever challenges awaited, they would face them as they had faced the past together. Their scars not hidden but honored as the marks of a journey that had led them against all odds to hope, the end.